The year is 1834. England is industrializing, urbanizing, and realizing that people are still inconveniently poor. So Parliament, in all its powdered Whig wisdom, decides to pass the Poor Law Amendment Act, a piece of legislation so revolutionary, and by revolutionary we mean ruthlessly efficient, it may as well have come with a tag that read, "Now with 100% more suffering." The goal? To reduce the cost of supporting the poor by making the experience so unpleasant, so degrading, and so soul-squashing that only the truly desperate would ever apply for help. Charity, the lawmakers decided, should be like chewing glass, technically possible, but not something you'd do unless absolutely necessary. Hello, travelers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Tonight, we will explore the topic, why you wouldn't last a day in a Victorian workhouse, and many more. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Enter the workhouse, a place designed not to lift the poor out of poverty, but to hammer them into submission with institutionalized misery. If you were too weak, too old, too sick, or too unemployed to support yourself, the state offered you a solution. Come live in a building that looks like a prison, feels like a factory, and feeds you like a boarding school for ghosts. Let's get one thing straight. Victorian workhouses weren't welfare. They were deterrents. Outdoor relief, where you could receive aid while living at home, was seen as too generous. Heaven forbid you be poor and still have access to your own pillow. So the government decided the only acceptable way to help people in need was to punish them for existing. Once you decided, or rather had no other choice but to enter the workhouse, the welcome committee was less friendly greeter and more grim-faced clerk with a quill dipped in disdain. Upon arrival you'd be met not with warmth or compassion, but with paperwork, suspicion, and a side order of bureaucratic judgment. You'd have to provide proof that you were destitute, not poor, not struggling, destitute. If you still had shoes with soles or a spoon with a handle, that was considered suspiciously luxurious. After your eligibility was confirmed, and by confirmed, we mean grilled like a common criminal, you were formally admitted, which is a polite way of saying, handed over your freedom and dignity at the door. And then came the real treat, your first taste of institutional humiliation. Clothes? Say goodbye to whatever threadbare scraps you showed up in. Everyone received the same stiff, scratchy uniform, designed not for comfort, but for maximum dehumanization. Congratulations, you're now indistinguishable from everyone else like livestock, but with worse PR. You'd be searched, scrubbed down, and treated as if you were more likely to smuggle in a revolution than a crust of bread. No personal items were allowed, no trinkets, no photos, no identity. You weren't a name anymore. You were a number in a ledger, and a future set of aching limbs. Families? Also gone. We'll cover that chaos in more detail in Chapter 2, but just know that upon entry, the first order of business was often separation. Husbands, wives, and children were all divided and sent to different wards. Victorian reformers called it necessary order. You might call it state-sanctioned heartbreak. Now, the workhouse wasn't some hidden dungeon tucked away in the countryside. These places were often smack in the middle of towns, tall grey buildings with barred windows and brick courtyards that screamed, "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here," in a very British way. They looked just enough like prisons that you got the message you were being punished for your poverty. Inside, everything was regimented, cold stone floors, iron gates, long corridors echoing with the sound of clogs and coughing. These were institutions built for control, not comfort. The architecture alone could depress a sunflower, and the staff, let's just say they weren't trained in customer service. The workhouse master ruled the place like a middle manager with delusions of monarchy. He enforced order, managed supplies, and made sure that not a single ounce of joy accidentally slipped into the routine. If your shoelace looked too cheerful, he'd probably confiscate it. Behind him stood a small army of officials, matron, schoolmaster, porter, nurse, and of course the all-seeing board of guardians. They were a group of stern-faced men whose main qualifications were being wealthy and having zero first-hand knowledge of poverty. Their motto might as well have been, "Why feed the poor when you can just morally shame them instead?" And yet, despite all of this, people still came. Why? Because the alternative was often worse. Starving in the streets, sleeping in ditches, selling your last possessions for a crust of bread. For many, the workhouse wasn't a lifeline, it was the last line before death. So no, the Victorian workhouse wasn't a place of refuge. It was a social experiment in suffering, dressed up as charity. You didn't go there to get help. You went there to be reminded, every waking moment, that needing help made you a problem. Think of it as a hotel where the concierge greets you with a shovel and a side-eye. So you've been admitted to the workhouse. You've surrendered your clothing, your dignity, and your name. Think you're done with the humiliation? Oh no, you've only just arrived at the sorting facility, where Victorian logic meets emotional carnage, because now it's time to be classified. In the eyes of the workhouse system, you are not a human being with emotions, relationships, or attachments. You are a category, a data point in a grim little ledger written in perfect penmanship and passive aggression. The system thrived on labels. The more dehumanizing, the better. Upon entry, officials wouldn't just ask who you were. They'd want to know what you were: man, woman, child, elderly, disabled, mentally ill, morally questionable, or just plain inconvenient. Each group had its own section, its own routine, its own rules, and never the twain shall meet. The very first thing that happened, often before you'd even had a chance to sit down or blink away the stink of boiled cabbage, was family separation. Yes, that's right. If you came in with your spouse, your kids, or your beloved grandmother, you could kiss them goodbye, and not even a long, dramatic goodbye. More of a brisk take the child to C, the mother to female able-bodied, and the husband to yard D. Next, and just like that, a family became a logistical problem to be filed, folded and forgotten into separate categories. Wives were sent to the female wards, husbands were dispatched to the male side. Children, depending on age and gender, were either crammed into a nursery or shuttled off to a children's ward, which was often just an adult ward, but with smaller chairs and even less food. Infants might be allowed to stay with their mothers for a short time, but only if the stars aligned, the paperwork sang, and nobody important objected. In some cases, even siblings were separated. Having a twin? Tough luck. The only thing they allowed to stick together was misery. The reason for this emotional demolition derby? Order and morality. The architects of the poor law believed that if you let people maintain family bonds inside the workhouse, they might start feeling comfortable. And the last thing anyone wanted was the poor feeling like they were welcome. That would defeat the entire point of relief through deterrence. To prevent any improper behavior, read compassion, the sexes were strictly segregated. No mingling, no visiting, no shared meals. The only time you'd see your spouse again was during chapel. And even then, men and women sat on opposite sides, supervised like teenagers at a chaperoned dance hosted by Puritans, and they better not make eye contact too long, or someone would assume they were plotting a scandal involving contraband gruel. As for communication, letters weren't exactly encouraged. You couldn't just stroll down the corridor to see how your son was doing. Want to ask the matron about your daughter's cough? Better hope you're fluent in officially sanctioned silence. The worst part? This wasn't a glitch in the system. This was the system. Breaking families apart was a feature, not a bug. Victorian reformers believed that familial attachments encouraged dependency. Love was suspicious. Affection was indulgent. If two people managed to hold on to hope, the institution considered that a management failure. Even if you were elderly and had spent the last 60 years with your spouse, the moment you stepped through the door, you were just two separate entries on the roster. One particularly grim example comes from the case of an elderly couple who'd been married for decades, but were forcibly separated into different wings. Their final reunion came not in life, but at a funeral. And no, that's not just Victorian melodrama. That's the actual ending to many love stories under this system. To be poor in the Victorian era was bad. But to be poor and emotionally attached to someone, that was apparently just greedy. This obsession with classification wasn't just about emotional cruelty. It was a mechanism for control. Segregation made it easier to monitor behavior, assign labor, and perhaps most importantly, minimize empathy. If you didn't see your family, you couldn't defend them. If you couldn't speak to them, you couldn't complain. And if no one around you shared your last name, you were much less likely to resist the system. Isolation was just another tool in the administrator's toolbox, right next to the ledger and the disapproving glare. It's no surprise then that many inmates, yes, they were literally called inmates, reported feeling like they had entered a prison, not a place of aid. Not that prisons were much better, but at least in prison you usually got to keep your bunkmate. By the time you'd been classified, separated, and shuffled off to your designated ward, any sense of connection you had was scrubbed out like a dirty shirt on a laundry board. And don't even think about reuniting with your family until you were discharged or until someone kicked the bucket. In many cases, "I'll see you when pigs fly" wasn't just a sarcastic farewell. It was genuinely optimistic, because in the Victorian Workhouse, love may conquer all, but it doesn't survive Victorian bureaucracy. If you ever had romantic notions about Victorian life, tea in the drawing room, long walks with lace parasols, or poetic sighs in candlelight, then let us now shatter that image with the blunt reality of the workhouse daily schedule. Because in here, life wasn't lived, it was endured, on a schedule so rigid it made military boot camp look like summer camp. Let's begin with the first insult of the day, the wake-up bell at 5 a.m., not 5:01. Not whenever you feel spiritually aligned. 5 sharp, 7 days a week including Sundays, because God may have rested on the 7th day. But in the workhouse, you were expected to rise before dawn and thank Him for another chance to be miserable. This pre-dawn wake-up wasn't a gentle affair. There was no coffee, no stretching, no birds chirping through open windows, just the hollow clang of a handbell and a voice shouting orders like a doomsday rooster. You were expected to jump out of your straw mattress if you were lucky enough to sleep on one, and begin the day of silence, routine, and despair. First came roll call, where every inmate stood in line and was counted like mismatched spoons in a very bitter draw. Heads were counted, bodies inspected, and any signs of slowness or grogginess were met with suspicion. Illness, prove it. Limping, better be from labor, not laziness. Once it was confirmed that everyone had indeed survived the night, it was time for mandatory prayers. Religion in the workhouse was less about spiritual uplift and more about moral reminding. These prayers were rarely joyful. You weren't thanking the Lord for blessings, you were apologizing for being poor. The subtext was always, "Dear God, sorry for existing inconveniently." Following this spiritual guilt trip, you were shuffled off to breakfast, a term that here means slightly warm sadness in a bowl. Meals were consumed in stony silence, at long tables under the ever-watchful eye of the staff. No talking, no smiling, and absolutely no dawdling. If you wanted a second helping, you were clearly a glutton. If you didn't finish your portion, you were ungrateful. There was no winning, just chewing. And then came the main event, labor. Whatever your category, able-bodied man, woman, or unlucky child, you were assigned a task that perfectly balanced backbreaking monotony with physical discomfort. We'll talk more about the horrors of specific work in Chapter 4, but for now, just know that once the workday started, it didn't let up until your soul begged for mercy. Each hour was meticulously accounted for. There were no breaks, just brief moments when one awful task paused long enough for another to begin. Sitting down without permission was a punishable offense. Talking? Forbidden. Standing still too long? Suspicious behavior. The logic was simple. If you weren't actively suffering, you were clearly plotting something. Even the idea of loitering was taken seriously. The workhouse viewed standing without a tool in your hand as a gateway drug to full-blown insubordination. If you dared to pause, say to wipe sweat off your brow, or quietly mourn your lost humanity, you might be reprimanded for idleness, or worse, insubordination. After all, why rest when you could be crushing gravel or sewing until your fingers resembled pincushions? Lunchtime arrived not with joy but with a kind of quiet dread. The second silent meal of the day was not a respite, but a brief pause in the schedule of suffering. Again, no talking. You were expected to eat your assigned portion with all the enthusiasm of a man chewing wallpaper paste. And if you finished early, congratulations, you could now sit in silence and try not to blink too loudly. The afternoon brought more work because of course it did. Any semblance of daylight was to be milked dry in the service of productivity. Even the idea of mental stimulation, books, music, conversation was foreign. The only reading material allowed was religious or moral instruction, and if you thought you'd sneak in a novel, think again. Joy was not on the menu. Eventually, after what felt like 17 years of labor, the workday ended around 6 or 7 p.m. But don't get excited, this wasn't time for leisure. The evening was reserved for more prayers, more silence, and more watching. You might be allowed to read a psalm or reflect quietly on how awful your life was, but only if your hands weren't too callous to turn the pages. By 8 or 9 p.m. it was lights out, back to your bunk, which may have been a hard mattress, or in some cases just a wooden board with a thin blanket. Privacy? None. Comfort? Laughable. At best, you got a few hours of uneasy rest before the bell rang again and the whole nightmare rebooted, and so the routine repeated. Wake, count, pray, work, chew, work more, pray again, sleep. No variety, no weekends, no holidays that weren't soaked in moral instruction and cheap potatoes. Every moment was accounted for, and every ounce of resistance was worn down by sheer repetition. Because in the workhouse, structure wasn't just policy, it was punishment. Or, as one might put it with a sigh, congratulations, your reward for surviving the night is 6 more hours of coal dust. Welcome to the part of the workhouse experience that truly lives up to its name, the work in workhouse. Because here your poverty wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a full-time job with no pay, no perks, and the constant threat of a splintered spine. Victorian reformers believed that hard labor had 2 magical effects. First, it kept the poor morally upright, and second, it kept them too exhausted to commit crimes like smiling or forming opinions. So every able body, regardless of age, gender or sanity, was assigned a task deemed appropriately punishing by the Board of Guardians, a group of men who never lifted anything heavier than a pen. Let's begin with the men, because their jobs were basically a contest to see how quickly a human body could disintegrate under pressure. If you were lucky, you'd be sent to break stones. That's not a metaphor. You were literally given a hammer, pointed at a pile of rocks, and told to break them into smaller rocks, all day, under the sun, or in the cold, or in the rain. Why? Because someone somewhere needed gravel. Or possibly because the guardians thought your spirit looked a little too intact. Then there was oakum picking, a delightful pastime that involved separating strands of tarred rope with your fingers. Originally a punishment in prisons, it was considered ideal for poor men because it was repetitive, unpleasant, and slowly ground your fingertips down to raw meat. Each man was expected to pick several ounces per day. The reward? A day older and a few skin cells poorer. Others were assigned to haul heavy carts, clean sewers, or carry loads of coal. One popular job was bone crushing, which is not an ominous nickname for anything. It literally meant crushing bones into powder to use as fertilizer. The symbolism was subtle. We don't just want your labor, we want your essence spread over a turnip field, and if you thought age or injury might excuse you from such tasks, think again. As long as you could limp, lift, or wheeze in rhythm, you were considered fully employable. Meanwhile, the women of the workhouse were treated to their own special brand of suffering, wrapped in lace and bleach. The most common job, laundry duty. But this wasn't your modern washer-dryer combo situation. This was boiling cauldrons, lye soap, and hauling wet linens that weighed more than the person scrubbing them. Your reward for successfully laundering 800 sheets in cold water while standing on aching feet. The pleasure of doing it all again the next day, except now with fewer fingerprints because the skin had started peeling off. If you weren't in the laundry room, you might be scrubbing floors, mending uniforms, or sewing until your fingers bled. Literally, sewing was both a punishment and a productivity measure. Seamstresses were expected to complete an obscene number of garments under strict time limits, all while hunching over in poorly lit rooms where ergonomic chairs were considered witchcraft. There was no chatting, no music, just the rhythmic sound of needles stabbing cloth and occasionally your own hand, as women tried not to cry into the hem of someone else's trousers. And let's not forget kitchen duty, which sounds almost pleasant until you realize it meant preparing meals for hundreds of people with ingredients that included boiled grey and last week's regrets. As for the children, well, they were put to work doing anything the adults couldn't survive doing twice. Chimney sweeping, water hauling, nail picking, errand running, and floor scrubbing were all on the menu. Some were loaned out to nearby farms or factories as cheap labor. Others stayed in the workhouse to serve as miniature janitors, cleaning floors too low for the adults to reach without screaming. It was like unpaid child labor, but with the added bonus of judgment. Children were expected to behave like tiny grown-ups, silent, obedient, and tired. The idea that a child might want to play was seen as dangerously radical. Any sign of energy was immediately punished with more work, presumably to teach them that joy is a gateway drug to laziness. Of course, accidents were common. Fingers caught in machinery, slips on icy steps, the occasional fainting spell from hunger, all part of the Victorian childhood charm. What makes all this worse is that most of this work wasn't even necessary. It wasn't part of a meaningful industry or public service. Much of it was task work, jobs created simply to keep inmates busy. The theory was simple: if you're poor, you should never be comfortable, and if you're not miserable, we're not doing our job. No one got paid. No one got thanked. The only thing you earned was more work and the faint hope that someday you might be poor somewhere else. So if you're wondering how these places kept people from wanting to come back, well, mission accomplished. The work alone was enough to send anyone running for the hills, assuming they still had knees. Because in a Victorian workhouse, if your hands weren't bleeding, were you even working? If you've made it this far in the Victorian workhouse, congratulations. You've earned yourself a meal. Unfortunately, that meal is about as rewarding as getting a high five from a brick wall. Because in the grand tradition of turning human suffering into public policy, the food served in the workhouse wasn't just bad, it was intentionally bad. You weren't there to eat after all. You were there to atone. Let's begin with the star of the show, gruel, a word so bleak it might as well come with its own thundercloud. For the uninitiated, gruel is a thin, watery porridge, usually made from oats, water, and the deep disappointment of whoever cooked it. It's the sort of meal that makes you nostalgic for boiled shoes, served hot temperature-wise, not emotionally. It was dished out in sad little portions, often ladled into dented tin bowls by someone whose job description included both serving food and judging your life choices. And yes, gruel was breakfast, every day. No milk, no sugar, no fruit. Just a warm, grey puddle of sadness. Occasionally, if fortune smiled upon you, perhaps a guardian was in a particularly merciful mood, you might get a piece of bread. And by bread, we mean a slice so dry it could double as building material. Butter, don't even ask. That was considered dessert in this house of gloom. Lunchtime offered a thrilling change of pace, a slightly different version of gruel or maybe a thin soup, usually containing vegetables that had clearly lost the will to live. Potatoes were rare enough to spark rumors. Did you hear? Ward C got a potato last week. No way, that's just a myth to keep us obedient. If you ever did get one, it was boiled into oblivion and seasoned with a single grain of salt, if the cook was feeling rebellious. The nutritional value of this culinary routine hovered somewhere between cardboard and despair. You weren't eating to thrive, you were eating to survive. Barely. Calories were calculated not to fuel you for labor, but to prevent you from actually dying on the property. That would have required paperwork. Meals weren't designed with the human body in mind. They were designed with the budget in mind, and the budget said feed them just enough to make it to next Tuesday. And God forbid you showed any enthusiasm for your rations. Enjoying food in the workhouse was seen as suspicious, even sinful. If you smiled after a bite, The cook might assume you'd hidden contraband herbs in your sock. Food wasn't just nourishment, it was punishment dressed up as policy. The idea was simple. If you didn't hate what you were eating, you weren't learning your moral lesson, because in the twisted logic of the era, poverty wasn't a social issue, it was a personal failing. And so every bowl of gruel, every tasteless crust, every flavorless cup of sorrow tea was part of your reformation. Hunger was a teacher, misery was a mentor, and lunch was the sermon. There was even an unspoken fear that if meals became too tolerable, people might get comfortable in the workhouse, which of course could not be allowed. No one must enjoy their punishment. That would be cheating. Dinner, if you can call it that, was usually a repetition of lunch, another helping of blandness, perhaps with a spoonful of resentment stirred in. There were no evening snacks, no drinks beyond water, and no such thing as second helpings unless you counted the smell wafting over from the other ward. Holidays offered little variation, maybe a slightly larger lump of boiled mystery, or the excitement of identifying what used to be a vegetable. For the elderly or infirm, food portions were even smaller. After all, they weren't earning as many calories through work, so why waste resources? Children, meanwhile, were fed with equal disregard. They weren't growing, they were simply shrinking more efficiently. And let's not forget the ambience. Meals were taken in silence, in long rows at echoing tables, under the watchful eye of staff who ensured that no one dared speak, smile, or remember what flavor used to taste like. The room often smelled of bleach, sweat, and hopelessness, which certainly didn't help the appetite. If you were caught sneaking food, or worse, trading a piece of bread for something equally forbidden like a conversation or a moment of joy, you could face punishment. Reduced rations, solitary meals, or even a stint in the punishment cell where you could reflect on your grave crime of wanting an extra crust. In short, food in the Victorian workhouse wasn't sustenance, it was a tool of control. A reminder, 3 times a day, that you were not a guest here. You were a burden, and every bite was meant to taste like guilt. So if you ever find yourself complaining about your bland morning oatmeal, just remember, breakfast doesn't energize you, it just happens to you. And in the workhouse, that was as good as it got. If you thought the worst part of the workhouse was the labor, the food, or the way your soul was slowly ground into a fine powder by 5 a.m. prayers, then you haven't yet visited the crown jewel of suffering, the infirmary. That's right, the Victorian Workhouse Hospital, a place where the goal wasn't to make you better, but to keep you from unaliving too visibly. To be clear, the infirmary wasn't exactly a sanctuary of healing. It was more like a waiting room for the afterlife, but with worse ventilation. You didn't go there to recover. You went there to rest your miserable body under a damp blanket while it did whatever it was going to do, heal, fester, or perish quietly. The medical motto might as well have been, "We can't cure you, but we can definitely watch." The conditions were, in a word, abysmal. In 2 words, absolutely horrifying. If you were lucky, the room had windows. If you were unlucky, it had patients who coughed like a Dickensian symphony and beds that creaked with every regret ever made. Cleanliness was theoretical. Beds were shared, blankets were questionably colored, and fresh air was something you read about in the Bible. And then there were the illnesses, a fun little parade of 19th century nightmares. Workhouses were breeding grounds for everything from typhus and cholera to the ever-popular consumption, also known as tuberculosis, or the one where you cough artistically until you die. If one person got sick, it was practically an open invitation for everyone else to join the plague party. These diseases didn't just visit, they moved in, redecorated, and invited their friends. The very design of the workhouse helped illness spread. Crowded dormitories, damp corridors, poor ventilation, and a general disdain for hygiene made the place ideal for bacteria. Personal hygiene wasn't a priority, because soap cost money, and caring cost effort. If you were coughing, sneezing, or visibly leaking, you were sent to the infirmary not to get better, but to be quarantined in low-quality silence. Once inside, treatment options ranged from the barely helpful to the wildly imaginative. The gold standard of care was bed rest, But rest in this case meant lying on a lumpy mattress while the person next to you coughed something chunky into the air. Privacy was non-existent, so was quiet, and good luck finding anything remotely resembling actual medicine. One popular tool of the trade, leeches. Yes, the squirming little bloodsuckers were still enjoying a medical moment. Got a fever? Let's bleed you. Got a cough? Let's bleed you. Lost your will to live? Well, maybe a few leeches will cheer you up. There was a firm belief in the cleansing power of bloodletting, because if you're weak, surely the solution is to make you weaker. Another classic, poultices. Soggy herbal compresses slapped onto wounds with all the precision of a toddler icing a cake. Or mustard plasters, which involved smearing mustard paste on your chest until it burned through your will to resist. These treatments didn't exactly cure illness, but they did provide a wonderful distraction from whatever was actually wrong with you. Then there was the ever-reliable cure-all, prayer. If you were too far gone for leeches and your lungs sounded like a haunted accordion, the staff would simply begin praying with increasing urgency. Religion and medicine were deeply intertwined, and often, the only thing more common than coughing in the infirmary was moral instruction delivered at bedside. Nothing soothes typhoid like being told your suffering is part of a divine lesson plan. Actual doctors were rare, and often only showed up once or twice a week. Most medical care was handled by the overworked and undertrained nurse, matron, or unlucky workhouse inmate, who knew how to fold a bandage without passing out. And while some staff may have tried their best with what little they had, the system was so underfunded and overcrowded that competent care was more myth than reality. Even childbirth, a process already dangerous in the best Victorian hospitals, was made worse by the workhouse environment. Women were expected to deliver babies in the same crumbling building where people were actively dying of dysentery. If you made it through childbirth without infection, fever, or judgment from the matron, you basically qualified for sainthood. And let's not forget surgery, which was rare but not unheard of. Anesthesia was still new and expensive, so most procedures were done the old-fashioned way. Grit your teeth, scream into the void, and hope you pass out before the bone saw gets to work. If you were lucky, someone might offer you a sip of gin or a wooden spoon to bite down on. If you were really lucky, someone would distract you by yelling Bible verses while you bled. It should be noted that refusing treatment wasn't really an option. If you were deemed sick, you were confined to the infirmary until someone with a clipboard decided you were either healed or deceased. Complaints were discouraged. Optimism was treated with suspicion, and if you happened to get better, well, your reward was being sent straight back to work. Nothing says welcome back to life like 12 hours of oakum picking with stitches still in your side. In short, the workhouse infirmary wasn't a place for recovery. It was a holding zone for suffering, overseen by people doing their best in a system that cared more about moral order than medical outcomes. Healthcare, like everything else in the workhouse, came with a side of judgment and a sprinkle of apathy, because in this place there's no anesthesia unless you count passing out from pain as a viable option. If you were holding out hope that life in a Victorian workhouse was at least free of arbitrary punishments, you might want to sit down, assuming you have permission, of course, because in this place everything was a rule, and breaking any of them, including the ones you didn't know existed, could land you in trouble faster than you could say, "Please, sir, may I breathe?" The rule book in a workhouse wasn't just long, it was practically biblical in its scope, and as cheerful as a coffin catalogue. It dictated when you could eat, when you could move, how fast you had to walk, and the correct way to button your institutional uniform. Spoiler, the wrong way was your way. The system wasn't designed to support you, it was designed to catch you slipping, and oh, the things you could be punished for. Talking during meals? Punishable. Moving too slowly during roll call? Punishable. Looking vaguely smug while washing laundry? Absolutely punishable. Smiling? Deeply suspicious. In fact, if you smiled and maintained eye contact with a staff member, they'd probably check to see if you'd stolen a potato or launched a rebellion. One inmate was reportedly punished for loitering in the hallway. He had collapsed from exhaustion. Another was disciplined for insubordination because she asked if the gruel had salt in it. It didn't, but the real offense was implying that food might be improved by flavor. These weren't just rules, they were spiritual landmines, and once you broke a rule, intentionally or not, you entered the not-so-fun house of Victorian institutional discipline. First stop, reduced food rations. Because clearly if you're too slow to break rocks or too chatty during silent prayers, the solution is to remove the 2 turnips keeping your organs alive. You might be dropped from 3 bland meals a day to 2 or even 1, consisting of dry bread and cold water, not for a day, sometimes for a week, because nothing builds moral fiber like slow starvation under supervision. Then there was isolation, which wasn't the peaceful, meditative kind. You weren't given a book and a blanket and told to think about your actions. You were tossed into a tiny, dark room with no comforts and all the charm of a root cellar. The walls were stone, the air was damp, the silence was absolute. You were there to learn a lesson, though what that lesson was exactly, no one ever really explained. And if your offense was truly scandalous, say, stealing a crust of bread, swearing under your breath, or walking on the left side of the corridor instead of the right, you might earn a spot in the infamous Black Book. This ominous ledger wasn't a fantasy novel or a Victorian poetry collection. It was a permanent record of every wrong move, kept by the workhouse master and sometimes even sent to local authorities or employers. Being written into the Black Book marked you as a troublemaker, a danger to the sacred order of institutionalized misery. Repeat offenders might be denied discharge, barred from outside employment, or reclassified as morally defective, essentially becoming persona non grata with a poorhouse postcode. Even thinking about stepping out of line could be dangerous. The workhouse wasn't just a building, it was an environment soaked in suspicion. Staff watched inmates like hawks with clipboards. Every action was interpreted through the lens of how is this person failing to be properly miserable. Whistling while folding laundry, you're mocking the system, finishing your chores too fast, clearly trying to avoid something. Any sign of humanity was cause for concern. And of course, all of this was justified in the name of moral reform. The logic was simple, if cruelly elegant. Poverty was seen not as a systemic failure, but a personal one. You weren't poor because wages were low or rent was high. You were poor because you were lazy, immoral, or just didn't pray hard enough. Therefore, discipline wasn't punishment, it was education. The whole place was one big, miserable classroom where every lesson ended with fewer teeth and more guilt. Even the punishments had a grim poetry to them. If you stole food, you weren't just punished with isolation. You might be forced to serve others during mealtimes, while receiving no food yourself. If you disobeyed a supervisor, you might be assigned humbling labor, like cleaning privies or scrubbing the same patch of floor for 12 hours. Nothing says we care about your soul like toilet water and mockery. Children weren't spared either. If they talked during lessons or playtime, what little they had, they could be whipped, isolated, or made to stand for hours on end as an example to others. Discipline wasn't meant to teach, it was meant to brand. It told you, you are here because you failed at life and we will not let you forget it. Inmates weren't just punished for what they did, but for who they were. Single mothers, the mentally ill, the elderly, anyone who didn't fit into the neat little box of productive citizen was watched more closely, judged more harshly, and punished more often. Being poor in the Victorian workhouse wasn't a condition, it was a crime without a trial. So yes, if you ever found yourself feeling even mildly cheerful in the workhouse, it was best to smother that feeling under a wool blanket of compliance, because as they say, smile and they'll assume you stole something. If there's one thing the Victorian workhouse system excelled at, besides boiling hope alive, it was transforming young people into tired, silent shadows of adulthood before their baby teeth had even fully grown in. In this institution of systemic dreariness, childhood wasn't a phase, it was a logistical error, promptly corrected with hard labor, stricter rules, and just enough food to stop them from collapsing too often. Children over the age of 7 were officially considered ripe for industry, and by industry we mean tasks designed to wear them out both physically and spiritually. These kids were drafted into the workhouse workforce faster than you can say unpaid internship. There was no trial period, no easing in, just a swift reassignment from small human to tiny laborer. If you were a boy, your future looked like a never-ending cycle of agricultural work, hauling heavy loads, scrubbing floors, or being sent out to nearby farms to assist with whatever bone-snapping task needed doing. It didn't matter if your limbs were still noodle-shaped or your hands barely fit around a broom handle. If you could walk, you could work. If you could limp, you could work slower. Girls, on the other hand, were herded into the workhouse equivalents of domestic hell. Laundry rooms, kitchens, and sewing tables awaited them with open, chafing arms. Girls were expected to learn the skills of future housemaids, cooks, or laundresses, all while surviving the daily onslaught of heat, steam, blisters, and the constant reminder that their value lay in how well they could fold a sheet without breathing too loudly. Praise, of course, was not part of the package. Workhouse staff believed that encouragement was dangerously close to affection, and affection was a gateway drug to rebellion. So instead, children received feedback in the form of disapproval, silence, or additional chores. If they completed a task, the response was "do it again." If they didn't, it was "do it with less whining." You might think, well, at least they got some education, right? And yes, they did. Technically, but education in the workhouse wasn't designed to enlighten. It was designed to domesticate. Reading, writing, and arithmetic were taught at the most basic levels, just enough so that children might one day read a label on a bleach bottle or calculate how badly they were being underpaid. And even that minimal schooling was constantly under threat. If a child was needed to sweep a floor, peel potatoes, or scrub mold from the wall with their fingernails, then school could wait. Learning came second to labor, and in many cases it didn't come at all. Teachers, where available, were often underqualified, overburdened, or just creatively cruel. Corporal punishment was the norm. A wrong answer earned you a caning. A late arrival earned you standing in the corner for hours and asking too many questions. That earned you a reputation as a troublemaker with suspicious levels of curiosity. And don't even dream of toys, games, or the concept of play. Toys were frivolous. Laughter was unproductive. Fun was actively discouraged, as it might lead children to believe life had something more to offer than grey walls and splintery tools. Recreation time, if it existed, usually meant standing silently in a courtyard until your legs gave out. Anything more joyful was seen as moral decay in progress. Worse still, these children weren't just trained for misery, they were trained to accept it as normal. The goal wasn't just to prepare them for jobs, the goal was to condition them for a life of silent servitude, to hammer out any flicker of self-worth that might someday grow into defiance. And if you think the outside world offered a better fate, think again. Many workhouse children were apprenticed out to employers at absurdly young ages. That meant being sent away, often permanently, to farms, factories, and households where the labor was harsher and the oversight even worse. These so-called apprenticeships were sometimes indistinguishable from slavery, only with more paperwork and fewer happy endings. The idea was that this training would make them useful members of society. But what it really did was rob them of childhood, individuality, and the capacity to dream. They weren't seen as children to be raised. They were problems to be managed, little machines in training for the great grinding wheel of industrial Britain. And if one of them dared to cry, they'd be scolded for weakness. If they asked for less work, they were told they were lucky to be clothed and fed. And if they broke under the pressure, well, that was just proof they weren't trying hard enough. So in the Victorian workhouse, childhood meant working like an adult and being blamed like one too. Their small hands were perfect for reaching into tight spaces, and equally perfect for waving goodbye to innocence, imagination, and anything resembling a carefree day. By now, it might seem like the Victorian workhouse was less a place and more a life sentence with mealtime, and for most people inside, that wasn't far from the truth. The idea that you could one day leave this bleak fortress of moral correction and resume a normal life was technically possible, but about as likely as finding butter in your gruel or joy in your laundry shift. Let's start with the most common way people left the workhouse, in a coffin. Morbid, yes, but honest. Between the malnutrition, infectious diseases, punishing labor and despair that seeped into your very bones, many inmates simply didn't make it out alive. For those lucky enough to survive, escape wasn't as simple as just walking through the front gate and tipping your cap to the gatekeeper. To be released, you needed a few things: a job lined up, a home to return to, or anyone willing to vouch for you and take responsibility for your pitiful, bureaucratically documented self. Spoiler alert, most people didn't have any of those. Poverty, after all, wasn't just about empty pockets. It was about burned bridges, vanished options, and a society that kept score like it was the Olympics of judgment. But even if you did secure outside employment, the road out wasn't paved with rose petals. You had to petition to leave, submit to interviews with the Board of Guardians, and demonstrate that you weren't just going to scamper off and become an unemployed moral hazard all over again. You had to prove you'd learnt your lesson, that your time in the workhouse had stripped you of whatever scandalous ambition led you to be poor in the first place. And once you were out, you weren't exactly free, because the Victorian Workhouse didn't just take your time, it stamped your name with a lifelong social stain. Employers, neighbours, landlords, once they knew you were pauper-born or had spent time in the house, their opinion of you sunk faster than a leaky coal barge. You were marked, not with ink, but with whispers, glances, and the unmistakable scent of second-class citizenship. Getting out of the workhouse didn't mean you'd escaped poverty, it just meant your poverty had upgraded to a different brand of miserable. Maybe now you lived in a tiny flat with mold, earned starvation wages at a factory, and juggled 3 jobs to afford 1 loaf of bread, but at least you got to choose which corner to cry in. That's what passed for progress. And don't forget, many of the so-called jobs you'd leave for were just as brutal as the workhouse labor, only with slightly fewer prayers and marginally more rats. Domestic servants, field hands, factory workers, chimney sweeps, seamstresses. Most of these roles were filled by former inmates because the workhouse had trained them to expect nothing more than long hours, low pay, and no dignity. So you got out, yes, but often just to start a brand new cycle of toil somewhere else. And heaven help you if you returned, because returning meant failure. It meant you'd gone out into the world and proven that the guardians were right about you all along. Repeat visitors were treated worse, punished harder, and spoken of in the same tone reserved for pests. It didn't matter what drove you back: unemployment, illness, bad luck, or simply the weight of being alone in an unforgiving world. To the system, you were just a boomerang of bad decisions. Some tried to escape through marriage, which was less about love and more about finding someone equally desperate. Women sometimes left the workhouse through matrimony, but the pickings were slim. Few men were lining up to marry someone labelled a former pauper, and fewer still were stable enough to offer more than a new brand of suffering with matching tea towels. Children, once apprenticed out, rarely returned, but that wasn't necessarily a happy ending. Many of them ended up in exploitative labor, dangerous conditions, or even worse, institutions. They hadn't escaped the system, they'd just been absorbed into its outer orbit. Satellite sufferers still spinning in the same bleak galaxy. In rare cases, some former inmates did manage to claw their way to something resembling comfort. A stable job, a rented room, maybe even a slice of bread with actual butter on a Sunday. But even then, the ghost of the workhouse clung to them. It showed in their quietness, in their stiff posture, in the way they ate quickly and suspiciously, as if someone might snatch the plate away mid-bite. Because once you've lived in a world where rules governed your every breath, it's hard to believe you've really earned the right to exhale. So yes, you could get out. But the truth was, freedom was just poverty with slightly more options. Less supervised, perhaps, but no less exhausting. The gates may have opened, but the chains? Those were psychological, social, and quietly permanent. By the early 20th century, the Victorian workhouse was finally starting to die out. Not with a bang, but with a wheezing bureaucratic cough. After nearly a century of punishing poverty like it was a competitive sport, even the British people began to admit that perhaps making poor people scrub walls until they wept wasn't the pinnacle of social progress. But like all bad ideas wrapped in red tape, Workhouses didn't just vanish, they morphed, rebranded, and haunted the future in ways their creators probably never intended, but somehow would have still approved of. The beginning of the end came with a series of reforms aimed at patching up the moral sinkhole that was the poor law system. By 1929, local governments were given the option to take over the old workhouses and convert them into hospitals or public institutions, effectively ending the system in name if not always in practice. The final nail was hammered in with the abolition of the poor law in 1948, replaced by the shiny new NHS and modern welfare state. In other words, Britain finally stopped pretending that hunger was a helpful life coach. But here's the catch. Just because the buildings changed didn't mean the mindset disappeared. The philosophy behind workhouses, that poverty is a personal failing, that help should hurt, that the needy must earn their survival, didn't die with the poor law. It simply changed outfits and started showing up in boardrooms and benefit offices. Welfare systems across the 20th century were shaped by people who still clung to the idea that too much kindness would lead to laziness, as though human compassion was some sort of slippery slope into national collapse. Means testing, moral policing, endless paperwork, and a deep distrust of those who ask for help. All of these are the ghostly echoes of the workhouse. Modern welfare may not force you to pick oakum until your fingers bleed, but it might make you prove your worthiness 7 times over just to get housing support. Where once there were iron gates and guardian boards, now there are online forms and wait times so long they qualify as a second childhood. You see it in the way homelessness is criminalized, in how single mothers are judged, in how unemployment is treated like a disease instead of a circumstance. These ideas didn't spring from nowhere. They're the long, bony fingers of the Victorian workhouse reaching into the 21st century, still wagging a finger at anyone who dares be poor without permission. But while most of the actual workhouse buildings have been demolished, repurposed, or buried under layers of polite forgetting, some still stand, and in a strange twist of historical irony, many have become museums. That's right, the very places where people once suffered in silence now sell tickets at the door and invite visitors to experience life in the workhouse. The experience, of course, comes without the hunger, the fear, or the 5 a.m. shouting. Visitors can now stroll through dormitories where families were once torn apart, peek into kitchens where gruel was ladled with more judgment than seasoning, and admire the punishment cells where joy went to die. All very educational, and all very surreal. Because while today you can buy a postcard of a workhouse bedpan or pose next to an oakum-picking station for a cheeky selfie, back then you lived the exhibit. Some of these places are even rumored to be haunted, which feels fitting, really. After all, if you were going to stick around after death, wouldn't you want to rattle some chains in the very place that stole your dignity in life? Ghost stories swirl around these sites, with reports of cold spots, phantom footsteps, and disembodied cries echoing through old wards. Whether or not the spirits are real, the emotional residue is undeniable. These were places built to break people, and even the air seems to remember. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of the workhouse isn't in the bricks or the echoes. It's in the attitude we still have toward poverty, the suspicion, the judgment, the instinct to ask, "What did you do wrong?" before asking, "How can we help?" The workhouse taught generations to equate need with weakness, and that lesson is proving incredibly hard to unlearn. And yet talking about workhouses today matters more than ever, not because we want to dwell on misery, but because we need to recognize how far we've come and how far we still have to go. Remembering the grim halls of the workhouse isn't about guilt or nostalgia, it's about understanding how systems built to punish can outlive their creators, quietly influencing the world long after the keys have rusted away. So yes, the workhouse is gone, the walls have crumbled, the rules have changed, and the uniforms have long since mildewed into dust. But the spirit of the institution, its cold logic, its moral calculations, its belief that help must hurt, that still lingers, in policy, in prejudice, in quiet conversations about deserving and undeserving poor. And as long as that legacy remains, the story of the Victorian workhouse isn't over, it's just changed addresses, Let's talk about what it was like to be a tourist in the 1800s. Picture it. The year is 1840, you've just polished your monocle, the skies are grey, and the road ahead promises adventure, enlightenment, and almost certain gastrointestinal distress. Welcome to the so-called golden age of tourism, a time when travel became fashionable, mildly affordable, and still mostly a form of socially accepted masochism. Before the 19th century, vacation wasn't really a word people used, unless it involved abandoning a plague-ridden town. Most people were born, worked, and died within a 10-mile radius of wherever they happened to fall out of the womb. Travel was for merchants, messengers, or soldiers, people with grim purposes and no hotel upgrades. The idea of traveling for pleasure was as absurd as wearing a top hat to milk a cow. But then came the Industrial Revolution, the great British invention of soot-covered progress. Suddenly, the world was filled with machines that went chug, clang, and occasionally explode. With factories came jobs, and with jobs came just enough spare time and pocket change to make travel seem like a thing. Enter the birth of tourism, loud, overdressed, and carrying far too much luggage. At the heart of this travel transformation were two mechanical marvels, the steamship and the train. Both of these transportation wonders promised speed, convenience, and just enough discomfort to make you long for your immobile village life. Steamships offered passengers a romantic voyage across the seas. If your idea of romance includes seasickness, soggy biscuits, and a bed small enough to suffocate in. Trains, meanwhile, chugged across entire countries like iron caterpillars, bringing with them new destinations and a thrilling proximity to coal dust. Trains were especially important in revolutionizing the very idea of where one could go. Suddenly, Londoners could escape to the English seaside in mere hours, only to discover that the English seaside was windy, grey, and served lukewarm tea in sand-filled cups. But it was different, and that was the point. And for the first time in history, even the middle classes could afford to be disappointed in new places. But don't be fooled into thinking travel was equally available to everyone. The 1800s were still very much a time of class-based tourism. If you were rich, you went on what was known as the Grand Tour. This was a rite of passage for young aristocrats who wanted to stare at ruins, pretend to understand art, and catch at least one scandalous disease on the continent. A typical itinerary included France, Italy, and Greece, ideally with a few stops to complain about local customs and take charcoal sketches of statues missing noses. Grand tourists traveled in style, private coaches, personal servants, and enough luggage to supply a small village with formal wear. Their goal was to return home cultured, refined, and preferably engaged to someone with an acceptable family tree and zero opinions. They came back with Greek vases, mild opium addictions, and long-winded travel journals filled with phrases like quaint local peasantry and suffered a mild stabbing in Naples. Now, if you were part of the growing middle class, meaning you had some money but still flinched at the idea of tipping, your tourism options were more modest. You might save up for a once-in-a-lifetime trip to Paris or Rome, armed with a guidebook, a stiff upper lip, and the hope your innkeeper wouldn't steal your boots. Alternatively, you might just take a day trip to Brighton, breathe in some sea air, and pretend that staring at waves was a form of personal growth. And then there were the poor. For the working class, travel was rare and usually involved walking somewhere uncomfortable. A real treat might be a religious pilgrimage, or the annual village outing where you and 37 neighbors piled into a cart, endured 12 hours of road bumps, and arrived just in time for rain. But even for the upper crust, travel in the 1800s was never easy. The roads were bumpy, the trains were smoky, and the ships were essentially floating petri dishes. There were no TSA lines, but there were customs officials who could, and often did, rifle through your pantaloons. Your fellow passengers might include livestock, snoring opera singers, or a man who insisted on quoting Milton through every tunnel. And don't get us started on the paperwork. The modern passport didn't exist yet, but travel documents did, and they were confusing enough to require a separate valise just to hold the bureaucracy. Languages were a barrier, maps were confusing, and Google Translate wouldn't be invented for another 150 years, which meant your best hope of ordering dinner was pointing at something and hoping it didn't move. Still, people kept traveling. Why? Because even a miserable journey promised one thing: bragging rights. You might have vomited for 3 straight days, been robbed in Vienna, and gotten sunstroke in Rome, but by George, you'd been there. You saw the Colosseum. You walked the streets of Paris. You almost fell off a cliff in Switzerland and wrote a postcard about it. So yes, this was the golden age of tourism. Not because it was easy or comfortable or even very fun, but because for the first time, a large number of people believed that leaving home, suffering abroad, and almost dying in another country was something worth doing, and maybe, just maybe, worth doing again next summer. Before the age of wheeled luggage and travel-size everything, the act of packing for a trip in the 1800s was less about planning for convenience and more about preparing for a 3-act play, in which your belongings were the cast, crew, and stage. The Victorian traveller didn't just pack, they migrated. To travel meant to uproot your domestic life, stuff it into a series of trunks, and then require 6 underpaid men to haul it all onto a steamship, while you stood nearby fanning yourself dramatically. Let's start with the basics. There were no suitcases, not in the sense we think of them. You didn't have your sleek polycarbonate carry-on with 360-carat gruels and a built-in charger. You had trunks, giant wooden or leather boxes bound with metal, riveted corners, and about as much give as a granite countertop. A single trunk could weigh upwards of 80 pounds when empty. Full, it had the potential to reach the weight of a small adult goat. And it was rarely alone. A respectable Victorian tourist might have one trunk for clothing, another for toiletries, one for food, one for books, and a 5th strictly for accessories. Accessories, mind you, not essentials. These included hat boxes, because a single hat was social suicide, shoe trunks, wig cases, glove tins, and the always reliable portable gentleman's grooming case, which held razors, brushes, colognes, and occasionally the soul of a crushed valet. Now we have to talk about the bathtub problem. The modern traveller gets by with hotel showers and a complimentary bar of soap that disappears faster than your dignity after a red-eye flight. But Victorians had standards, even if they weren't exactly hygienic. Since many inns and guest houses provided neither private bathrooms nor anything resembling clean water, some travellers brought their own collapsible bathtubs. Yes, portable tubs, usually made of canvas, supported by a wooden frame, and carried by a servant who almost certainly questioned the meaning of life with every step. But the absurdity didn't end there. Travellers also packed writing sets, complete with quill pens, inkwells, blotting paper, sealing wax, and ribbon for binding letters. This wasn't for fun, it was required. A proper Victorian never visited a place without also documenting it in florid prose for Aunt Mildred back home. And if the penmanship looked like a spider got into the absinthe, well, that was just part of the charm. When it came to clothing, however, packing reached levels of operatic melodrama. Victorian women, in particular, faced the sartorial equivalent of a hostage negotiation. First, the corset. You didn't leave home without one, unless you wanted to be publicly accused of moral decay and improper spine support. Next came the chemise, drawers, multiple petticoats, a bustle, if fashionable, and then the dress itself, complete with bodice, sleeves, and probably some sort of ornamental doily stapled to the back, bonus points for a crinoline cage underneath, which made sitting impossible and doorways optional. Add to this outerwear, gloves, day and evening versions, walking shoes, dress shoes, bonnets, parasols, shawls, muffs, and of course travel morning attire, in case someone inconveniently died while you were away. It wasn't just luggage, it was textile warfare. Men didn't get off lightly either. They were expected to change clothing for nearly every event. Travel, afternoon tea, formal dinner, country strolls, and possibly dueling, which, depending on your vacation choices, could be a real thing. Waistcoats, overcoats, stiff-collared shirts, ascots, detachable cuffs, top hats, and walking sticks were just the start. Heaven forbid you appear in a dinner jacket meant for 7 p.m. at a 6:30 seating. One false fashion move, and your social ranking was reset to person who smells of cheese. And remember, there were no laundromats. At best, you found a local washerwoman and prayed she didn't confuse your silk stockings with someone else's goat harness. So many travelers just packed more. Why wash when you can simply bring 3 extra shirts and a prayer? This obsession with luggage didn't just weigh down horses. It created an entire micro-industry of porters, valets, ladies' maids and packing experts. That's right, packing was a profession. Wealthy travelers brought someone whose sole job was to fold, roll, stack, and reorganize your 57 items of clothing until they fit into your 13 overstuffed trunks. If something wrinkled en route, the packing expert would personally faint in shame. And finally, because every journey needed flair, some travelers added decorative flourishes to their luggage. Monogrammed trunks, velvet hat boxes, silver-edged grooming kits. Nothing said refined worldliness like carrying your underpants in a container worth more than a rural school teacher's yearly salary. To the modern traveler, this all sounds ridiculous. Why drag a collapsible bathtub across Europe when you could just not? Why carry 5 evening gowns on a trip to the coast? The answer lies in the Victorian obsession with respectability, routine, and the crippling fear of being perceived as unprepared. For them, travel wasn't about comfort. It was about maintaining their domestic identity while abroad. You might be seasick, sunburned, and surrounded by goats, but by thunder you'd do it in a proper collar. So next time you complain about an overpacked backpack or a tangled phone charger, just remember, in the 1800s someone hauled their entire bedroom set just to see a mildly famous rock in France. So you've packed your 14 trunks, your emergency tea caddy, and a travel coat that weighs more than your future regret. Now comes the fun part, getting to your destination without vomiting, crashing, or becoming a cautionary tale in a local newspaper. Welcome to 19th century transportation, a thrilling combination of soot, claustrophobia, and structural uncertainty. Let's start with the steamship, the oceanic wonder of the Victorian era. In theory, steamships made sea travel faster, more efficient, and less reliant on the moods of the wind gods. In practice, they were floating misery factories. Unless you were fantastically wealthy and could afford a private first-class cabin with a personal steward and access to real vegetables, your experience aboard a steamship was something closer to a damp nautical prison sentence. Cabins were cramped, often windowless, and usually shared with strangers, rodents, or one of each. The bedding was questionable, the air stale, and the smell best described as old cabbage mixed with coal and poor decisions. Privacy was a luxury, and so was the ability to stand upright without hitting your head on a beam. Then there was the motion, the constant, soul-shaking, stomach-flipping motion. Seasickness wasn't just a possibility, it was practically part of the ticket package. Entire decks would reek of nausea, passengers would stagger around like extras from a zombie play, clutching handkerchiefs, peppermint oil, or their last shred of hope. Food didn't help. Dining on a steamship involved boiled meat, grey potatoes, and something labelled pudding that had clearly lost all connection with joy. The water was sometimes salty, sometimes brown, and occasionally both. And while you were trying to keep your meagre lunch down, there was always that one guy on deck, calmly reading poetry, untouched by the chaos, and universally hated by the rest. Of course, there was also the fear of sinking. Steamships were modern, yes, but safety regulations were, let's say, experimental. Fire, collision, and boiler explosions were frequent enough to keep insurance clerks employed and widows in mourning. Lifeboats were few, and most passengers didn't know where they were anyway. In the event of a disaster, your best bet was prayer and a fashionable life preserver, if you remembered to pack one. Now, say you made it to land alive. Great, time to hop aboard a train. The Industrial Revolution's answer to what if a cannon had seats. Trains were fast, lightning fast by 19th century standards, but speed came at a price, usually paid in soot, deafness, and mild trauma. Early trains were loud, like trying to nap inside a drum solo. Passengers were treated to a non-stop concert of hissing steam, screeching wheels, and conductors yelling "all aboard" like it was their final act on Earth. Windows were often open air, which meant every trip came with a complimentary dust facial and lungful of coal smoke. Fancy a picnic lunch? Not unless you enjoy your sandwiches garnished with ash. Comfort was elusive. Wooden benches were the norm in third class, while second class got you some actual padding, straw-stuffed and lightly flea-infested. First class was better, assuming you didn't mind paying a month's wages to sit on velvet while watching peasants sneeze below. But the most exciting part of train travel? You might get robbed, especially if your train crossed remote areas at night, where bandits and highwaymen hadn't yet learned that pistols and steam engines don't mix. Trains were targeted by opportunists, looking to make off with valuables, luggage, or the occasional roast chicken. Oh, and derailments weren't rare. Early braking systems were designed by optimists and executed by amateurs. If your train didn't arrive on time, it was often because it had arrived somewhere else entirely, like a ditch. And when trains weren't an option, or if you were feeling particularly medieval, you had the pleasure of riding in a horse-drawn carriage. It sounds charming, right? A gentle trot through the countryside? That's only true if you enjoy bone-jarring impacts, unpredictable horses, and a strong chance of being tipped into a ditch during a storm. Roads were rarely paved and carriages bounced like angry trampolines over every bump, rock and puddle. Suspension was more suggestion than system. Wooden wheels creaked ominously with every turn, and if your carriage broke an axle halfway through a forest, congratulations, you were now camping until someone with tools wandered by. Carriage interiors could range from elegant and upholstered if you were a duchess, to damp and splintery if you were anyone else. You shared the ride with strangers, whose conversation might range from mildly offensive to actively deranged. Stopping for food meant risking roadside inns where the stew looked suspiciously like last week's guest and the ale was stronger than most marriage vows. And let's not forget, there were no shocks, no seatbelts, and absolutely no concept of motion sickness bags. You were on your own. Your choices were to endure, vomit quietly, or open a window and pray the wind caught your shame. So what have we learned? Getting from A to B in the 1800s was more of a trial by endurance than a leisurely start to your vacation. Between the sea's betrayal, the train's thunder, and the carriage's chiropractic damage, travel wasn't just transportation, it was character development. And the good news? The train was faster than walking. The bad news? So was dysentery. Ah, the Grand Tour. That illustrious tradition where upper-class young men from Britain and beyond were packed off to Europe with a tutor, an allowance the size of a small duchy, and the vague hope they'd return with a better grasp of Latin and fewer opinions about local wine. It was supposed to be the crowning jewel of aristocratic education. In practice, it was often equal parts sightseeing, social climbing, and trying not to get mugged outside a Roman forum. Let's start with the purpose. The Grand Tour wasn't technically a vacation. It was a finishing school disguised as a continent-spanning road trip. A 17-year-old heir might have spent years learning Latin verbs, ancient history, and how to nod politely at political opinions. But none of it meant anything until he'd stood in front of a crumbling temple in Greece and loudly misidentified it as probably Roman. The idea was simple. Take a privileged, sometimes painfully sheltered young man and send him abroad to absorb culture. That meant studying art, architecture and classical ruins, ideally without catching something incurable or getting seduced by an opera singer named Contessa. Whatever, the trip usually lasted between several months to several years, depending on the family's fortune and the traveller's ability to avoid duels. Destinations were carefully chosen for maximum sophistication and danger. Italy was an absolute must, the spiritual home of art, sculpture and emotional overreactions. In Venice you could float down a canal while trying to look pensive. In Florence you were expected to weep gently in front of Michelangelo's David, and in Rome you'd spend days studying antiquity, which translated loosely to sketching naked statues while trying not to laugh. France was also essential. Paris was the city of manners. Salons and powdered people who said things you didn't understand but nodded at anyway. It was there that many tourists learned the subtle art of pretending to enjoy a 7-hour banquet filled with eels and philosophical debates. Even the bread had rules, especially the bread. Greece, while slightly more rugged, held an almost mythical status. It was the cradle of civilization, the birthplace of democracy, and a great place to break your ankle while scrambling over ancient stones in inappropriate shoes. And if you were very unlucky, your tutor might insist you recite Homer's Iliad in Greek, while standing in the very ruins of Troy just before a local goat relieved itself on your travel notes. But the real heart of the Grand Tour wasn't the destinations, it was the educational charade. Wealthy families hoped their sons would gain intellectual polish. This often meant sketching cathedrals regardless of artistic skill, keeping meticulous journals which inevitably devolved into 8 fish again. It was suspicious, and attending lectures so long and dull they made marble statues look lively. One of the key stops was always the Louvre, which in the 1800s was already a sprawling maze of art and ego. Theoretically, visitors came to admire masterpieces. In reality, they wandered the halls with aching feet, avoiding eye contact with their Latin tutor, who insisted on explaining every single painting with historical footnotes. You didn't leave the Louvre enlightened, you left dehydrated, confused and slightly more hostile to neoclassicism than you'd ever imagined possible. Of course, all this learning was strictly for young men. Women, especially unmarried ones, were rarely allowed to do the full grand tour. They might be permitted to accompany family members on select parts, but only if chaperoned by someone so boring that scandal would die from sheer boredom. And even then, the goal wasn't self-improvement. It was to not accidentally become interesting. That would have been disastrous. As for the young men, their experiences varied wildly. Some returned transformed, cultured, sophisticated, and ready to misquote Virgil at dinner parties. Others came home with less noble souvenirs, gambling debts, sketchy tattoos, entire crates of looted pottery they swore were gifts. In fact, a healthy portion of European museums today owe their contents to grand tourists who didn't see the harm in pocketing a few marble chunks here and there. When in Rome apparently included mild theft. There was also the issue of romance, or more precisely, flirtation seasoned with scandal. Many a grand tourist found themselves entangled in foreign affairs of the heart, frequently with locals who had much better fashion sense and far fewer moral hang-ups. Letters home were vague. Studying Italian opera, for instance, might actually mean completely besotted with a soprano named Giulia, who carries a stiletto in her corset. Of course, no tour was complete without travel mishaps. Carriages broke down in the Alps, boots were stolen in Naples. One poor soul from Yorkshire allegedly lost an entire crate of wigs in a Venetian canal. Language barriers led to dinner orders involving organs no one could identify. Getting lost was practically a rite of passage, and through it all the noble tourists soldiered on, sketching ruins, mispronouncing everything, and pretending to understand the finer points of Rococo. By the end of it all, the weary traveller would return home transformed, or at least tanned. He'd bring back souvenirs, opinions, and possibly an exotic illness. His Latin might still be shaky, but he could now speak passionately about Roman columns and had at least 3 opinions about the Venus de Milo. He was officially a man of the world, and so the Grand Tour walked the fine line between refinement and exhaustion. Sure, it offered a rare chance to engage with the great achievements of civilization, but mostly it was a test of endurance. A long, winding, frequently awkward journey that could make even the Louvre feel like an obstacle course. Because sometimes, culture means suffering politely. And yes, the Louvre was less about appreciating art and more about surviving a 3-hour lecture in Latin. By the mid-1800s, the game of travel was changing, dramatically and noisily. No longer the exclusive stomping ground of rich heirs and Latin tutors. The world of tourism was suddenly opening its iron gates to a new and terrifying force, the middle class. These were the shopkeepers, clerks, factory managers, and ambitious schoolteachers, who had just enough disposable income and just enough time off to make travel seem feasible. They couldn't afford carriages lined with silk or dinners hosted by Parisian countesses, but they also didn't want to spend the rest of their lives staring at the same cobblestone street and dreaming of the Alps. Enter Thomas Cook, the man who would turn the concept of travel from adventure with danger to a mildly structured ordeal with printed timetables. In 1841, Cook, a humble cabinet maker and devout Baptist, organized his first group tour. The destination? A temperance meeting. The mode of transport? A train, booked at a group rate. The mood? Disappointing, but cost-effective. From that slightly underwhelming start came a revolution. Cook saw potential. People wanted to travel, but they also wanted someone else to figure out how to do it without getting lost, robbed, or permanently stuck in Belgium. So he provided all-in-one packages: trains, hotels, meals, guides, and strictly timed bathroom breaks. The Thomas Cook travel package was born. What made these tours so popular wasn't glamour, it was predictability. The Victorian middle class, newly empowered by railways and just wealthy enough to buy uncomfortable shoes, flocked to Cook's vision of safe, structured travel. No more bargaining with shady innkeepers. No more wondering which cathedral was which. With Cook, you knew what you were seeing, where you were sleeping, and precisely when you'd be eating that suspicious boiled meat again. Naturally, with structure came crowds. Entire tour groups descended on landmarks like a well-dressed, politely repressed swarm. Local shopkeepers rejoiced. Local pickpockets did too. Museums were now filled with the sound of shuffling feet, confused murmurs, and guides reading aloud in monotone, while someone in the back tried not to sneeze on an ancient tapestry. And to keep things from descending into total chaos, tourists were increasingly armed with the ultimate middle-class weapon, the guidebook. The king of these was Baedeker's, a meticulously organized, often condescending little red book that told you everything from the number of steps in a tower to which inns wouldn't give you cholera. Baedeker's was more than helpful. It was a social passport. Reading it marked you as a person of intellect, good taste, and an uncanny ability to follow instructions. Don't touch that fresco. Tip that waiter exactly 2 francs. Beware of the beggar with one eye and a suspicious cough. Thanks to Baedeker, tourists didn't need to ask embarrassing questions. They could just read embarrassing facts quietly and pretend they already knew. But of course, not everything improved. Yes, there was more organization, but with it came a new problem: standardized mediocrity. Meals on tours were bland and often recycled from last night's regret. Hotels were practical but depressing, featuring rooms so beige they felt like punishment. Schedules were rigid. You were now part of a machine, a slightly damp, overbooked machine that left the Colosseum after exactly 25 minutes, no matter how much you wanted to stare at the cracks. You no longer discovered things, you were shown them. And while this made travel safer and more accessible, it also made it feel a bit like homework. The thrill of getting lost in Florence, gone. The charm of stumbling into a weird cafe where an old man offers you something that might be cheese, vanished. Now it was all guide approved and tour certified. And then came the exercise. Travel for the middle class wasn't a lounge, it was a stairmaster. Every historic site involved climbing something. Bell towers, fortresses, craggy hilltop monasteries with 300 steps and no railings. Victorian shoes were not designed for this. You arrived breathless, sweaty, and more than a little suspicious of your tour guide's claim that it was a short climb. And then when your knees had declared war and your corset whispered betrayal, you'd sit down to dinner, which, to put it generously, was a game of culinary roulette. You might get a charming local stew, or you might get yesterday's fish pretending to be today's beef. And you would eat it, because it was part of the package, and you paid for it, and you'd smile through the gastrointestinal consequences like a proper Victorian. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't even always enjoyable. But it was travel. Honest, uncomfortable, democratic travel. And for the middle class, it meant something huge. They belonged now. They could see Rome, Paris, the Alps, and return home with souvenirs, stories, and an alarming number of paper fans. They might not have had opera boxes or private tutors, but they had Cook's coupons, and that counted for a lot. So yes, imagine a cruise with zero fun, 80% stares and dinner that could fight back. That was middle-class tourism in the 1800s, and honestly, it was glorious. It's easy to romanticize 19th century tourism from the perspective of the tourist. Awe-inspiring cathedrals, grand ruins, majestic landscapes, and the joy of discovering that foreign cheese doesn't always agree with your intestines. But let's flip the lens. Imagine being the local minding your own business in Florence, or Athens, or a small French town that just wants to sell wine and not be mispronounced every 5 minutes, and then suddenly the tourists arrive. And by arrive we mean descend. They came in flocks, armed with parasols, guidebooks, and an unshakable confidence in their ability to communicate using slow, loud English. They wore entirely too much clothing for the climate, took notes on everything, and insisted on asking if your goat was authentic. Locals didn't see a gentle influx of curiosity. They saw a marching parade of confused aristocrats and anxious clerks looking for the Colosseum next to the canal. To the average 19th century local, tourists were not fellow adventurers. They were walking wallets with weird hats. Shops started adjusting their prices accordingly. You want this hand-carved olive wood crucifix? For you, my friend, only twice the price I told that farmer 5 minutes ago. Haggling became an Olympic sport, and the more you gestured with your gloved hand, the more likely it was you'd pay too much for lukewarm soup and a souvenir made last week. Of course, part of the tension came from fashion. The tourists didn't dress like locals. They didn't even dress like sane people in warm weather. British women arrived in southern Italy wearing full-length dresses, corsets and bonnets that looked like overturned salad bowls. Men in wool suits would collapse dramatically in town squares, declaring, "It's rather warm, isn't it?" While locals wearing linen and common sense sipped wine and tried not to laugh. Then came the language barrier. Victorian tourists had approximately 3 approaches to speaking foreign languages. Say it in English, but louder. Say it in English, but slower. Say it in broken French. Then shrug and hope for divine intervention. The result? Complete and utter chaos. Tourists tried to order lunch and accidentally proposed marriage. They asked for directions and got goat auctions. One well-documented case involved an Englishman in Spain attempting to ask for La Iglesia, the church, but accidentally requesting La Iguana. He was shown a lizard. He bought it anyway, for reasons lost to time. And let us not forget the etiquette mishaps. Local customs were baffling to tourists, who viewed any deviation from their own norms as either charming or suspicious. In places like Greece, kissing someone on both cheeks as a greeting was interpreted by stiff British gentlemen as either a threat or a marriage proposal. Italians who spoke with their hands were feared to be casting spells. A German toast might accidentally spark a declaration of war if misinterpreted by a nervous visitor from Cornwall. Religious and cultural sites were especially vulnerable. Tourists would barrel into monasteries with muddy boots, talking loudly, snapping photographs with sketchpads, of course, and insisting they were here to appreciate the culture by demanding tea and complaining about the acoustics. Monks tried to remain serene, nuns prayed for patience, and somewhere, always, someone was trying to feed a sandwich to a sacred statue. Nothing says respect for culture like loudly demanding tea in the middle of a monastery. Locals began to adapt. The more entrepreneurial ones opened cafes, inns, and souvenir shops that catered to foreign tastes, serving bland food, overboiled vegetables, and traditional local crafts that bore a strong resemblance to factory leftovers from last Thursday. Meanwhile, older residents simply sighed, crossed the street, and prayed the tourists wouldn't ask for directions to the Eiffel Tower again. They were in Rome. And then there were the artists and writers, the romantic tourists. These were the ones who set up easels in the middle of busy markets or sat for hours sketching an authentic peasant woman who just wanted to buy onions and go home. Locals stared. Some posed, others threw onions. Perhaps the most bizarre local experience came from watching the tourist ritual of documentation. They wrote about everything. Absolutely everything. Whole villages found themselves described in leather-bound journals as quaint, curious, or smelling faintly of fish. Entire towns were reduced to 2 lines of elegant handwriting. Today we encountered a delightful farmer. He smiled, then sneezed, then offered us something unidentifiable in a jar. We declined. He shrugged. We drew him. Even the tourists themselves were aware of how obnoxious they could be. Some tried to blend in by wearing local clothes, usually very badly. One British traveller in Turkey attempted to dress like an Ottoman official and was mistaken for a runaway circus performer. Another American in Paris tried to go native and ended up being arrested for public loitering in an avant-garde hat. So no, the locals weren't impressed. They weren't offended exactly. They were tired. Tired of translating menus, tired of tourists mistaking bathhouses for churches, and very tired of people asking if they accepted shillings, francs, or prayers as payment. But in a strange way, they also came to depend on them. Tourists brought money, stories, change. They turned sleepy towns into destinations, created new jobs, and unintentionally launched a global tradition of getting mildly irritated at foreigners who walk slowly while reading maps. And so, while the tourists wrote glowing reviews of ancient ruins and charming countryside folk, the locals simply poured another glass of wine, raised an eyebrow and braced for next summer. Today's tourists want selfies in front of the Eiffel Tower, queue for hours to glimpse the Mona Lisa's mysterious smirk, and shell out £9 for gelato that tastes like disappointment. But in the 1800s, let's just say the bar for attraction was set somewhere between mildly tragic and medically questionable. Back then, the big draw wasn't flashing neon signs or animatronic pirates. It was battlefields. Yes, sites of brutal violence and mass death were top-tier destinations for the 19th century traveller. A visitor to Belgium might tour Waterloo not for a historical reenactment or a museum, but to walk the muddy field where thousands had died just a few decades earlier. Guides would point out spots where notable officers fell, or where Napoleon maybe stood, or where a cannon once might have rolled. No plaques, no fences, just you, some grass, and a mild existential crisis. Some visitors even brought picnics, because nothing pairs with cold ham sandwiches quite like imagining the anguished screams of cavalrymen. It's like therapy, but with worse bread. Then there were the ancient ruins, of course, a staple of the grand tour and middle-class itineraries alike. Tourists flocked to Rome, Athens, and Egypt, not for immersive education, but to climb on things and chip off pieces for souvenirs. Roman columns were basically upscale vending machines, insert chisel, take-home marble. Egyptian tombs were ransacked for curiosities, and the Parthenon got treated like a very artistic jungle gym. But when the ruins weren't nearby, some attractions were less grand. In fact, one of the most baffling trends of the era was the tour of industry. Picture this: middle-class families boarding carriages to go stare at coal miners. Not coal mining, just miners, working, covered in soot, half-starved and wondering why Susan from Manchester is sketching their misery like it's the view from Mont Blanc. These tours were advertised as educational glimpses into the working class, but let's be honest, it was poverty tourism and it sold out fast. Factories, workhouses and even prisons were also hot stops. You could visit a cotton mill to watch 12-year-olds operate spinning machines, or tour a penal colony and hear a cheerful guard explain how many lashes it took to correct a character flaw. Some tourists even bought pamphlets or took home samples. Here's a pamphlet on chimney sweeps, and here's a button I found under an orphan. Cheers. But not every attraction leaned on death and despair. Some leaned on the deeply weird. Wax museums, like Madame Tussaud, were huge crowd pullers. Tussaud herself had originally made wax death masks of guillotined nobles during the French Revolution, which gave the museum the perfect combination of educational horror and don't trip on the bloodstain. In Victorian London, tourists marveled at hyper-realistic wax figures of murderers, monarchs, and the occasional overly sweaty Napoleon. And speaking of macabre must-sees, embalmed saints were all the rage. Europe was full of churches and shrines that proudly displayed mummified religious figures encased in glass. Tourists came to admire their incorruptible toes, wax-covered faces, or hauntingly well-preserved fingernails. Some saints even had travel schedules. They were carted around for special occasions, like a spiritual roadshow. And yes, people brought their children. There were also cabinets of curiosity, which were less like modern museums, and more like what would happen if Ripley's Believe It or Not had been run by a well-funded hoarder. Here you could find taxidermied animals with two heads, shrunken skulls from the mysterious Amazon, or fragments of Saint Somebody's kneecap, alongside suspiciously ordinary pebbles labeled Druid stones. Authenticity, optional. Enthusiasm, mandatory. But perhaps no attraction was more problematic and popular than the freak show. Yes, the Victorians turned human difference into entertainment, and thousands lined up to gawk. Performers with genetic conditions, disabilities, or rare body types were paraded under cruel monikers. The bearded lady, the human skeleton, the Siamese twins. These shows were often exploitative, but they were also among the most profitable forms of live entertainment in the 19th century. People came in droves, children stared, artists sketched, and everyone pretended it was educational, while privately whispering that it made them feel oddly spiritual. In truth, it just made them odd. And let's not forget the rocks. There was always a rock, a small, unimpressive stone that someone somewhere claimed Caesar once stubbed his toe on. Or perhaps it was a druidic altar, or a Viking grave. No one really knew, but guidebooks said it was important, and so carriages full of tourists would arrive, stand in silence, nod respectfully, and jot down meaningful rock, deep energy in their journals. Which brings us to the golden truth of 19th century tourism. Tourist traps absolutely existed, except instead of overpriced keychains, they came with unsanitary food, questionable water, and a distinct chance of catching something unpleasant. You might spend 4 hours reaching a famous healing spring only to discover it was a puddle guarded by a goat, but you'd sip it anyway, because the guidebook said to. And no, there weren't gift shops, but there were locals selling authentic relics that bore a suspicious resemblance to common household items dipped in mud. One clever Frenchman famously made a fortune selling fragments of Marie Antoinette's mirror, which turned out to be leftover pub glass and wishful thinking. In the end, 19th century tourist attractions weren't about amusement or comfort. They were about stories. The weirder, the better. You didn't travel for relaxation. You traveled to survive something strange and live to exaggerate it in your memoirs. So the next time you scoff at a highway dinosaur park or a wax Elvis in Vegas, remember, in the 1800s people walked 6 miles uphill in corsets and leather shoes to stare at a rock, and maybe catch cholera. After weeks of train rattling, steamship nausea, and cathedral overload, the 19th century tourist faced the single most important question of the journey. What should I bring home that proves I nearly eliminated in Naples? Enter the golden age of souvenirs, a curious blend of relics, rubble, romance, and regret. For many travelers, the goal wasn't just to survive Europe, it was to own a piece of it, ideally something they could display in their drawing room, while dramatically recounting how they rescued it from the hands of a suspiciously friendly monk. You didn't just want to tell people you went to Rome, you wanted to prove it, ideally by placing a bust of Caesar on your fireplace and letting guests politely pretend it wasn't staring at them. The most prized souvenirs were things like ancient pottery, statues, tiles, or literal chunks of ancient architecture, and yes, people took them. Not bought, took. Travelers with more money than archaeological ethics would chip off pieces of temples, scoop coins out of old wells, or casually borrow decorative pieces from monasteries that were not technically for sale. If it wasn't nailed down, it was considered fair game. If it was nailed down, someone probably brought a crowbar. This led to what historians call cultural exchange and what museums now call awkward international lawsuits. But not all travelers had the budget for a stolen sarcophagus, so the souvenir industry quickly evolved. Markets and street vendors across Europe began selling everything from ancient Roman coins, actually buttons, to mummy dust, probably dirt from behind the tavern. Forgery became an art form. If you wanted a relic, there was always a man behind a curtain who knew a guy who had just one left. You could buy tiny glass vials of Nile water, which often turned out to be local river sludge. You could acquire Greek scrolls printed last week in Marseille. There were even relic kits containing bits of cloth supposedly from saints' robes and wood chips allegedly from the cross. One woman famously returned to England with what she claimed was a saint's molar, until it was discovered to be a sheep tooth carved with a nail file. Still, many tourists went the safer route and simply purchased weird hats. The Victorian obsession with headwear extended abroad, and travellers would collect turbans, fezzes, straw hats, bonnets, and anything else that could crush their hair into submission. A gentleman returning from Turkey might stride off the boat in full Ottoman headgear, declaring himself transformed, while a lady from Bristol wore a Spanish mantilla for the next 5 years like it was a badge of trauma. But the souvenirs weren't always objects. Sometimes they were affairs. Because if there's one thing stronger than ancient ruins, it's a romantic entanglement with a foreigner who can quote poetry in a language you barely understand. The Grand Tour was as much about flirtation as it was about education. Wealthy young men supposedly refining their minds in Rome and Florence often ended up refining their pickup lines instead. Whether it was a gondolier with tragic eyes or an opera singer named Claudia, romance abroad was practically expected. These relationships were usually brief, sometimes scandalous, and occasionally resulted in someone returning home with more than just a tan. For middle-class tourists, the stakes were even higher. An affair abroad wasn't just spicy, it was dangerous. Women in particular had to navigate tightrope thin lines of propriety. A solo conversation with a man in a cafe? Scandal. An accidental letter mix-up with a hotel clerk? Gossip for months. And heaven forbid anyone actually kissed someone in public. Victorian society would combust on the spot. Still, tourist love stories happened constantly. They were written about, whispered about, and occasionally ended in emergency weddings, discreet bribes, or sudden extended visits to distant cousins in Cornwall. Sometimes they even ended up in the newspapers under delightfully vague headlines, like "Young Lady Returns from Italy with Curious Circumstances." Romance wasn't the only intangible souvenir. Many travelers returned with diseases they couldn't pronounce, sunburns in the shape of foreign hats, and emotional damage from attempting to explain to a Venetian gondolier that they just wanted to go around in a circle and look at things. Some brought back sketchbooks full of crumbling ruins and crooked trees. Others carried journals packed with dramatic sentences like, "Today I saw the sun set over the Acropolis. I wept. Then I stepped in donkey waste," and a few lucky souls managed to bring home actual curses, mostly from tombs they shouldn't have poked. There's even a well-documented case of a tourist who sat on a priceless Greek artifact, thought it was just a very uncomfortable bench, and had to be extracted by a team of monks while trying to apologize in bad French. The artifact now lives in a museum. The tourist pride never recovered. By the time the average traveler arrived home, their luggage was full of questionable treasures, cracked statues, boots that never quite dried out, possibly haunted jewelry, authentic maps of Atlantis, a broken compass someone swore had belonged to Vasco da Gama, and a scarf that looked fantastic in Morocco but now just confused the neighbors. But despite the scandals, the scams, and the scabies, these souvenirs meant something. They were proof. Proof that you'd been somewhere, that you'd survived bad food, worse roads, and at least one goat-related incident. That you'd lived a little, or at least faked it convincingly, because in the end every chipped pottery shard, every forged relic, and every emotionally complicated Venetian love letter was part of the same story. I went to Europe, and I brought back everything except restraint. By the end of the 1800s, something truly miraculous had happened. Tourism had transformed from an elite, borderline masochistic experiment into a booming, semi-respectable industry. And while most 19th century travelers spent their journeys clutching their stomachs, mispronouncing local landmarks, and hauling around hat boxes like they were part of a traveling opera troupe, they accidentally invented the modern vacation. So yes, credit where credit is due. They walked so we could fly. And yes, they also vomited on steamships so we could post beach selfies from 35,000 feet. Let's break down just how much we owe those wheezing, overdressed, sunburned pioneers of leisure. 1. Hotels got sort of better. Before the Victorian tourism boom, lodging meant inns that also served as taverns, barns, or someone's suspiciously damp spare room. Sanitation was a gamble, beds were often shared, and room service meant a goat wandering in with a stale roll in its mouth. But as more people began travelling, not just nobles with private carriages, but teachers, clerks, and the tragically curious, the demand for consistent lodging skyrocketed. Enter the modern hotel, still overpriced, still full of uncomfortable pillows, but now with doors that lock and beds without fleas. A miracle. By the late 19th century, hotel chains were forming, uniforms appeared, bellboys scowled professionally, and guests started receiving something wild: clean towels. 2. The passport became a thing. Victorian travellers didn't carry modern passports. At best, they had a hastily written letter from a government official saying, "Please don't arrest this man, he's just very lost." But as international tourism increased, so did the need for official documents that made you look slightly less suspicious at the border. By the early 20th century, passports became standardized, thanks in part to the chaos caused by thousands of tourists who looked exactly like colonial administrators but couldn't remember how to say bathroom in French. Today's passports, with their stamps, holograms, and biometric data, exist because someone in 1874 lost their travel letter in a fountain and tried to bluff their way into Belgium. Spoiler, it did not go well. 3. Museums and monuments got real funding. When early tourists began descending on European ruins, churches, and relics like well-dressed locusts, a problem emerged. These sites were falling apart, sometimes from age, sometimes from enthusiastic souvenir theft, sometimes from people climbing the Colosseum in corsets to get a better view of the moon. Governments began to realize that cultural heritage had value, not just spiritual or historical, but economic. Tourists wanted to see old things. If those old things fell over, so did the local economy. And so came the museum boom. New galleries opened, old temples were reinforced, signage improved from "Here be Romans" to actual readable placards. Tourists still wandered through with blank stares, but now they at least knew what century the statue was from before tripping over it. 4. The idea of travel as personal growth was born. Before the 1800s, you travelled for commerce, war, or escape. Leisure was not on the itinerary, but Victorian tourism introduced the notion that travel could be transformative, that a person might go abroad and return better. And sure, better sometimes meant more smug, slightly tanned, and prone to quoting Herodotus at dinner. But the idea stuck. You didn't just go on vacation to rest. You went to become someone else, or at least briefly pretend to be someone else, preferably someone who drinks wine before noon and owns a sketchbook. This tradition continues today in everything from soul-searching gap years to yoga retreats in Bali, where Karen from accounting finds her inner self and loses her passport. 5. The birth of the tourist stereotype. Let's not pretend it was all progress. The Victorians also birthed the eternal tourist archetype, the clueless, overdressed foreigner with a camera or sketchpad, loudly demanding comforts from home while standing in the shadow of ancient wonder. Every time someone complains about a lack of ketchup in Tuscany or asks where the nearest Starbucks is in Kyoto, they are spiritually channeling a 19th century gentleman in Greece, asking if the ruins come with a chair and a proper cup of tea. They gave us tourist fashion disasters, loud miscommunications, and the phrase, "I don't think they understand English, let me try louder," a legacy we continue with alarming consistency. 6. Tourism as a global industry. Perhaps the biggest legacy of Victorian tourism was the realization that travel could be a business, a massive one. From Thomas Cook's humble tours to the sprawling infrastructure built to accommodate increasing traffic, tourism morphed into an industry. It created jobs, markets, railways, and entire economies based on the sacred ritual of selling overpriced things to confused people in hats. It's why today, in almost every country on Earth, You'll find tour operators, guides, and one restaurant that insists its carbonara is famous. All of it traces back to when Victorians rolled up in horse-drawn carriages asking where they could buy a postcard and a monk's femur. In the end, Victorian tourists were absurd. They were overdressed, underprepared, and obsessed with buying statues they couldn't lift. They collapsed in the heat, misunderstood every menu, and mistook sacred relics for souvenirs. They climbed ruins, offended monks, kissed strangers, and journaled about it all with enormous confidence. And yet they built the path. They carved out the rituals, the infrastructure, and the itchy curiosity that still defines global travel today. So the next time you post a filtered sunset over Santorini, or complain that your Airbnb doesn't have strong Wi-Fi, remember this. You are standing on the shoulders of someone who once fainted in the Louvre because their corset was too tight. They walked. They got lost. They probably brought home a cursed amulet and a rash, but without them we wouldn't have airlines, tour groups, hotel minibars, or that one guy on your trip who always asks, "Is this on TripAdvisor?" They walked so we could fly, and they vomited on a steamship so we could take picture from a plane. Long before the pencil helped anxious students fill out bubbles or desperate authors gnaw through writer's block, it began its life in the most unlikely of places, a stormy patch of northern England in the 1500s, near a sleepy village called Borrowdale. If you imagine a dramatic landscape of moody skies, soggy sheep, and men wearing doublets and suspicion, you're almost there. One day, after a violent storm uprooted trees in the hills, locals stumbled upon a strange black substance in the earth. It wasn't shiny like coal, but it left dark marks on hands, clothes, and anything it rubbed against. Unlike most other minerals, it didn't crumble into useless dust. It glided. It slid like a whisper, but stained like regret. Naturally, being good Englishmen, the locals did what any practical person would do with a mysterious black rock. They used it to mark sheep. Seriously. Farmers began slicing the soft, dark material into sticks and rubbing it onto the fleece of their livestock. It was the original form of sheep tagging. Modern livestock ear chips? GPS tracking collars? Please, these were Tudor sheep. They got custom graphite tattoos before it was cool. But soon the shepherd's secret got out. Artists caught wind of it, and that was the moment everything changed. Word spread across England and beyond. There was a magical stone in Borrowdale that could draw like charcoal, but smoother, darker, controlled. Artists from London to Florence suddenly wanted to get their powdered fingers on it. Shepherds became suppliers, and thus an international black market in art supplies was born, run for a brief moment by people who smelled like wet wool. The material would eventually be called graphite, from the Greek word graphein, meaning to write. But back then, no one really knew what it was, so of course they just assumed it was lead. Why not? It was dark, metallic looking, and English science at the time operated on the principle of close enough. This is why for centuries people called pencils lead pencils, and why to this day school children continue to chew on them like they're stress-relieving snacks from the periodic table. Spoiler, it's not actually lead. If you've been chewing pencils your whole life, don't panic, unless you've also been eating the erasers, in which case we need to talk. Now, here's where things got awkward. Pure Borrowdale graphite was incredibly rare and found nowhere else in the world. This made it ridiculously valuable. England, realizing it had stumbled upon the Renaissance equivalent of printer ink, declared the mines a national secret. They surrounded the graphite pits with guards. Extraction was limited, and the material was literally cut into blocks and sold by weight, like you would do with precious metals or fine cheese. This created a global shortage of writing rocks. France, furious that they had to buy their sketch sticks from the British, would later try to create their own synthetic version. But that's a tale for a later chapter. At this point in history, pencils as we know them, sleek wooden tubes with tips that snap right when you're finally focused, didn't exist. Instead, people used raw graphite sticks, which were fragile, smudgy, and prone to breaking at the worst possible moment. To protect them, users began wrapping the graphite in string, unraveling it as needed like a very disappointing spool of ribbon. Others wrapped it in sheep gut because why not keep the pencil's origin story consistent? You could mark your sheep with sheep, very poetic. And let's not forget the elite pencil cases of the day. Elegant silver or ivory holders that gripped the graphite like a tiny black dagger. These were status symbols, art tools, and in a pinch weapons in heated cartographic debates. By the late 16th century, the pencil had gone from livestock accessory to a prized tool of cartographers, artists, and anyone who needed to quietly judge their surroundings in sketch form. And yet it remained strangely humble. No fanfare, no gold trim, just a lump of mysterious earth that drew the world in black and grey. Looking back, it's kind of amazing. From a remote sheep-filled hill came a material so vital that it would one day power everything from military maps to moody teenage poetry. It was the invention of expression through friction, and no one quite saw it coming. And yet there it was, in the mud, in a hill, waiting to be scribbled into immortality. So the next time you pick up a pencil, before you chew it, snap it, or drop it behind the radiator, remember this: you're holding the legacy of accidental chemistry, confused shepherds, and one very cooperative rock. Once the graphite-rich hills of Borrowdale started producing enough material to mark sheep, sketch portraits, and occasionally smudge everything in your pocket, it was only a matter of time before the Renaissance art world caught on. Because if there's one thing the Renaissance did well besides inventing perspective, rediscovering the human body, and painting ceilings you're not allowed to touch, it was turning everyday tools into masterpieces. The pencil, still raw and string-wrapped, marched confidently into this era like it belonged in the Louvre before it even existed. Let's set the stage. It's the 1500s. Leonardo da Vinci is making all the other artists nervous by inventing flying machines between sketching perfectly proportioned torsos. Michelangelo is in full chisel mode. Albrecht Dürer is busy turning German anxiety into woodcuts. And here comes the humble graphite stick, small, smudgy, and full of potential. At this point, artists had been working primarily with charcoal, silver point, and ink, each with their own issues. Charcoal was messy and hard to control. Silver point required coating the surface with special gesso and could not be erased. One mistake and your monk looked like he had 3 noses. Ink was bold but merciless. You spilled it, you cried. Then comes graphite, and artists were like, wait, you're telling me I can make detailed, controlled lines and erase them without ruining the parchment? Cue the collective Renaissance gasp. What made graphite such a revolution wasn't just that it worked. It was that it worked better than anything else they'd tried. Graphite could be hard or soft depending on how it was cut, used dry with no messy preparation, blended and shaded, which made it ideal for drawing dramatic shadows on half-naked muscular men posing dramatically next to Greek columns, a staple of the time. And most importantly, it fit in your robe. Portability mattered. Renaissance artists traveled constantly, lugging around scrolls, canvases, jars of paint, and probably an apprentice or two. Graphite sticks were lightweight, efficient, and didn't leak onto your anatomical notes. But let's not romanticize too much. These early pencils were delicate. With no wooden casing, the graphite was prone to snapping if you so much as sneezed near it. You carried them carefully, often wrapped in fabric or nestled in velvet-lined cases like they were royal infants made of coal. And sharpening them, that was a whole production. Before the invention of the humble pencil sharpener, which wouldn't show up until the 19th century, artists had 2 choices: whittle the end with a penknife, or use the dagger you kept for self-defense and artistic angst. This led to an unfortunate trend of dual-purpose tools. Artists were regularly seen hunched over benches, muttering to themselves while carving the tips of their graphite sticks like deranged sculptors. And more than a few sketchbooks contained suspicious holes or torn pages from someone getting just a little too enthusiastic with their blade. You didn't just sharpen your pencil, you forged it like a knight preparing for battle. The point could be too dull for fine detail, or too sharp and gouge the parchment like it owed you money. It wasn't uncommon for apprentices to be given the sacred duty of maintaining the artist's points, which was a fancy way of saying, "Sharpen these so I don't scream during the next Madonna sketch." And yet, despite all its mess and fragility, graphite became a kind of visual shorthand for genius. When people saw quick, light sketches in a notebook, shaded heads, muscular limbs, flying machines with questionable aerodynamics, they saw raw creativity. Pencils became the tool of the idea stage. Paint was the final product, but graphite was the brainstorm. It was the whisper before the aria, the doodle before the fresco. Even Da Vinci's legendary notebooks stuffed with inventions, studies, mirror-written secrets and notes about lunch were littered with graphite-like lines. Historians argue whether he used real Borrowdale graphite or a more primitive carbon-based stylus, but the spirit was the same. Pencil-like tools fueled the imagination of the Renaissance. The pencil also helped artists break out of the rigid religious formalism of earlier centuries. With a tool that allowed for soft shading and gradual correction, artists began exploring more naturalistic forms, people who looked less like saints and more like that guy who sells olives at the market. Real muscles, real expressions, real mistakes. The pencil allowed humanity to return to human figures. Of course, not everyone embraced this. Some conservative patrons still preferred their saints with stiff robes and immaculate halos. But artists? Artists were falling in love with a dirty little stick that let them capture light, motion and emotion like never before. And if a model got a little too fidgety, well, that dagger wasn't just for sharpening. If you thought pencils were just humble writing tools, quietly resting in your desk drawer until standardized tests appear like jump-scare demons, think again. In the late 1700s and early 1800s, pencils were a matter of national security. That's right, spies, secrecy, science, and Napoleon Bonaparte, all tangled up in the surprisingly cutthroat world of pencil production. Because nothing says global domination quite like a well-sharpened drawing implement, it all started with England and its secret stash of pure, solid graphite. The same stuff dug from the hills of Borrowdale that we met back in Chapter 1. But now the stakes were higher. Graphite had become essential not only for artists, but also for military uses. Cannonball molds, writing wartime dispatches, sketching maps, and creating diagrams for weapons that were equal parts terrifying and impractical. The British quickly realized they weren't just sitting on a quirky art material. They were sitting on a strategic resource. And so they did what any good imperial power would do. They locked down the mine like it was Fort Knox. They restricted access. They mined only in secret batches. They even passed laws to control graphite sales and threw people in jail for stealing it. Smuggling graphite became a real profession. Thieves would sneak into mines, chip off chunks, and sell it to shady dealers. The graphite black market was officially a thing. Because nothing screams rebellion like illegally selling art supplies to your cousin in Belgium. On the other side of the channel, the French were fuming. They had artists. They had engineers. They had an empire of their own to run, thank you very much. But what they didn't have was high-quality graphite. And to make matters worse, a certain short general named Napoleon Bonaparte had started conquering half of Europe and now needed reliable pencils to draw battle maps, label cannons, and write angry letters to his enemies and occasionally his ex, Josephine. But the British weren't sharing. So Napoleon did what any ego-driven conqueror with a soft spot for sketching might do. He demanded that someone in France invent a pencil substitute. Enter Nicolas Jacques Conté. Conté was a painter, balloonist, chemist, inventor, and all-around 18th century multi-tool of a man. If you needed something built, drawn, floated, or exploded, he was your guy. And when Napoleon asked him to invent a pencil that didn't rely on British graphite, Conté rolled up his sleeves and went to war. Scientifically. In 1795, Conté created the first modern pencil lead, not a pure stick of graphite, but a clever mix of powdered graphite and clay, baked at high temperatures. By adjusting the ratio of graphite softness to clay hardness, he could produce leads that were lighter or darker, softer or firmer, and most importantly, consistent. This wasn't just a wartime workaround. It was a revolution in writing technology. France now had its own source of pencil cores, and they no longer needed to rely on smugglers with questionable hygiene and suspicious trench coats full of rock crumbs. Napoleon was thrilled. Artists rejoiced. British spies wept silently into their teacups. But Conté didn't stop at just inventing the modern lead. His system gave rise to something every artist, architect, and paranoid test-taker now knows all too well: pencil grading. Those cryptic codes on pencils, HB, 2B, 9H, you can thank Conté's invention for that alphabet soup of graphite precision. Here's the basic breakdown. H equals hardness, more clay, lighter lines, less smudging. B equals blackness, more graphite, darker lines, smudgier but smoother. HB is the balanced middle child, your classic school pencil. Add numbers, and it becomes a graphite arms race. 9H is so hard it could etch glass. 9B is so soft it melts in your hand like butter with performance anxiety. Why this matters? Before Conté's grading system, using a pencil was like grabbing a mystery wand. You never knew if it would draw a line or snap on contact. After Conté, precision, control, glorious bureaucracy. It was perfect for France, a country that values artistic flair and a good, firm system of labels. By the time Napoleon was exiled twice, France had its own robust pencil industry, and the rest of Europe followed suit. Germany, America, and others adopted Conté's process and improved upon it. The era of the raw graphite stick was over, and while England still held on to its natural graphite mines like a miser hoarding cookies, the rest of the world moved on with clay-blended leads, mass-produced wooden casings, and just enough pencil dust to permanently stain your backpack. So yes, Napoleon may have failed to conquer Russia, but he did indirectly spark a scientific leap that changed how humans draw, write, and fail math tests forever. All because he wanted his own supply of angry sketching tools. By the time the 19th century rolled around, the humble pencil had already endured quite the identity crisis. It had been mistaken for lead, stabbed with knives for sharpening, wrapped in string like an artisanal cheese, and had fueled artistic revolutions across Europe. But now it was America's turn, and in true American fashion, they took the pencil, gave it a marketing budget, dressed it up in a flashy color, and shoved it into the trembling hands of every schoolchild from Boston to Boise. The American industrial age loved two things: mass production and clever branding, and the pencil industry was no exception. Big companies and the American branch of the German firm Faber saw the potential of pencils not just as tools but as products, things to advertise, standardize, and sell in boxes of 12 with a side of anxiety. Pencils became cheaper, more consistent, and most importantly, everywhere. But before we get to the glory of the two pencil and its eventual reign of Scantron tyranny, let's talk about a bizarre question that every curious child and suspicious adult has asked at least once. Why the heck are pencils yellow? The answer, oddly enough, has to do with the Himalayas and a little something we might call pencil prestige warfare. In the 1880s, manufacturers wanted their pencils to stand out, not just in quality, but in perceived sophistication. Enter Koh-i-Noor, an Austrian company that produced a luxury pencil made with high-quality graphite allegedly sourced from the Far East. To market their elite stick of scribbling greatness, they chose the color bright yellow, which at the time was associated with royalty, exoticism, and things expensive enough to make your monocle pop off. The name Koh-i-Noor came from the famous diamond of the same name, because nothing screams art supplies like naming your pencil after a legendary gemstone that caused international lawsuits. The marketing worked. People began associating yellow pencils with high-quality exotic origin stories and somehow intellectual superiority. American manufacturers quickly jumped on the bandwagon. Yellow was now the standard, so instead of selling you a bland stick of grey wood and graphite, companies sold you the illusion that your homework was powered by mystic Himalayan magic, and it stuck. The yellow pencil became so iconic that to this day, deviating from it feels emotionally wrong. Give someone a red pencil and they'll assume they've done something wrong. Hand them a blue one and they'll just stare like you violated some unspoken schoolroom treaty. As the 20th century arrived, pencils in America began evolving rapidly, helped along by schools, testing boards, and the nation's deepening fear of pen ink smudges. Suddenly, children across the country were being told to write their names in pencil, fill out forms in pencil, and make sure they didn't press too hard or too soft, or they'd ruin both the paper and the mood. Enter the 2 pencil, the Goldilocks of graphite. Not too dark, not too light, just right. It became the pencil of choice, not necessarily because it was the best for drawing or writing, but because it was the best for machines. As scan reading technology developed in the mid-20th century, multiple choice tests became the new gladiator arena for American youth. And these machines, picky as a Victorian dinner guest, demanded a very specific pencil to read answers clearly. The Un2 pencil wasn't just a writing tool anymore. It was an entrance pass to college, a gatekeeper of grades, and a universal symbol of student stress. It was required in classrooms, on exams, and in bureaucratic hellscapes where fountain pens dared not tread. Meanwhile, pencil companies continued to duke it out. Dixon Ticonderoga, for example, cemented itself as the Cadillac of yellow pencils, using slogans like "the world's best pencil," and letting their iconic green and gold ferrules, that's the metal band by the way, shine like a badge of honor. And let's not forget the eraser, soft pink and usually worn down to a useless nub within the first week of school. Paired with the yellow barrel, it gave the pencil the color scheme of a confused banana sundae, and yet somehow it felt right. Even as pens, keyboards and styluses grew in popularity, the yellow pencil refused to die. It became a comfort object, a backup plan, a secret stash item you kept in your bag just in case. People who hadn't used a pencil in years would still find one in their junk drawer, like a tiny hexagonal ghost of standardized tests passed. They painted it yellow so it looked smart, like a banana that could take standardized tests. And honestly, it worked. The pencil became both a utility and an icon, a perfect mix of function and flair, hard work and pure branding wizardry. Before the world gifted us the simple joy of flipping a pencil over and erasing our bad decisions with a flick of the wrist, the process of correction was, let's call it, crumby. Literally, long before rubber came into the picture, people erased pencil marks using moist bread, specifically small chunks of day-old breadcrumbs. And while that might sound quaint or like a Victorian cooking tip, it was about as efficient as using a scone to remove a tattoo. Artists, writers and students across Europe kept balls of bread tucked away to dab at their mistakes, and yes, it was messy. The only thing worse than smudging your drawing was erasing it, and realizing your paper now looked like it had been through a dough explosion. These crumb erasers did the job, barely. Bread absorbed graphite reasonably well, but it left behind a battlefield of floury debris, not to mention the constant temptation to eat your stationery supplies when you got bored or hungry. And let's face it, no child should be asked to choose between correcting their spelling and eating a buttery distraction. The game changed in the late 18th century, when the world got its first real introduction to rubber, the weird, bouncy substance derived from the sap of the rubber tree. In 1770, English engineer and polymath Edward Nairn accidentally discovered that natural rubber, then called caoutchouc, could erase pencil marks far more cleanly than stale ciabatta. It's worth noting that Nairn was just trying to make a new type of drawing tool. The erasing powers of rubber were a happy accident, like discovering penicillin or realizing your cat can open doors. After Nairn's discovery, people began calling the stuff rubber because it rubbed out pencil marks. That's right. The term rubber has nothing to do with bouncing balls or rain boots. It's literally named after its ability to erase your foolishness. But as with any new technology, there was skepticism. Rubber erasers were fragile. They degraded quickly in air, and early batches had a distinctive smell that made your pencil case reek like a damp science experiment. Plus, they weren't cheap. For a while, erasing was still the luxury of the rich and the clumsy. Enter Charles Goodyear. Yes, the tire guy. In the mid-1800s, he discovered vulcanization, a process that made rubber tougher, more elastic, and less prone to turning into sticky goo during warm weather. Vulcanized rubber became the standard for erasers, allowing them to be produced at scale, survive in a desk drawer, and remove errors without melting onto your exam. Suddenly, the rubber eraser was no longer a novelty. It was an institution. Pencil manufacturers began selling small rubber cubes alongside their writing tools, and slowly but surely, erasers became the unsung heroes of the pencil world. They didn't write history, but they rewrote a lot of bad drafts. Now you might think the eraser-tipped pencil, a design so obvious it feels like it came down from the heavens, would be immediately embraced by society. But oh no, when Hyman Lippmann patented the eraser on the end pencil in 1858, people were deeply suspicious. Teachers were the first to protest. Children, they cried, must live with their mistakes. Clearly they'd never graded a test where someone spelled elephant as LFT. Some instructors feared that easily erasable writing would lead to sloppiness, carelessness, or horror of horrors, creative freedom. After all, if mistakes can be undone, what's to stop students from trying things? Then there were the pen snobs. They argued that real intellectuals used ink, and ink was permanent. Pencil was for sketchy drafts and forgettable footnotes. Erasers to them were crutches for the indecisive. One can only assume these were the same people who thought sneezing was a character flaw. Despite resistance, the eraser-tipped pencil caught on like wildfire. Children loved it. Artists adored it. Office clerks, whose lives revolved around neat ledgers and crushing existential boredom, saw it as a gift from the gods. The ability to instantly correct an error without putting down your writing tool was revolutionary. The pencil had become a complete, self-contained mistake machine, and the eraser was its little pink safety net. By the 20th century, the eraser became a design playground. You had your standard pink wedge, your white vinyl artist's eraser, the novelty erasers shaped like animals that didn't erase anything but still smelled like strawberries, and of course the tiny erasers no one ever used at the end of mechanical pencils, half decoration, half cruel joke. Yet, no matter the form, erasers gave people one thing above all: permission. Permission to mess up, to fix it, to try again, whether it was a failed math problem, a misspelled love letter, or an eyebrow you accidentally added to your still life of fruit. The eraser stood by with gentle optimism, whispering, "It's fine. We'll pretend this never happened." Finally, a way to pretend you didn't draw a mustache on your math homework. By the time the 20th century really got rolling, the pencil had already carved out its place in the world, both literally and metaphorically. It was no longer just a tool for sketching statues or surviving Napoleon's map-making mandates. It had become something else entirely, a cultural companion, an object of comfort, creativity, and low-level chaos. The pencil had transcended its practical function and entered that strange realm of objects we love, misuse, and quietly collect without knowing why. Because let's be honest, everyone knows at least one person with a drawer full of unsharpened pencils, most of which are commemorative, stubby, or too pretty to use. It's a universal phenomenon. People hoard pencils like they're preparing for an artistic apocalypse, despite the fact that 90% of them will never see the inside of a notebook. There's something almost sacred about a fresh, unsharpened pencil, its potential in a stick. It might write a novel, or a grocery list, or nothing at all, but it could, and that's what matters. But the pencil's cultural rise wasn't just about stockpiling, it was about behavior. Enter the chewer, the doodler, the sharpening addict. Chewing pencils, for example, is not just a nervous habit, it's practically a rite of passage. We chew them during tests, we chew them during awkward silences, we chew them during existential crises in third period math. And while chewing plastic pens just feels vaguely wrong, chewing pencils has that nostalgic woody tang of poor decision-making and standardized tests. Is it healthy? No. Is it satisfying? Deeply. A chewed pencil says, "I've been through something and I still don't know the answer to question 4. Then there's the doodler. These are the people who treat margins like art galleries. They start with a squiggle, then a flower, and suddenly there's a fully detailed dragon wearing a top hat next to their biology notes. Doodling with a pencil is pure subconscious creativity, an outlet for minds that refuse to sit still. You've seen the type, intense look in their eyes, tip of the tongue poking out, pages covered in vines, robots or suspiciously well-rendered eyeballs. And yes, they're probably ignoring the lecture, but they're also developing the hand-eye coordination of a Renaissance master. And of course, sharpening. Oh, sharpening. For some, it's maintenance. For others, it's a deeply meditative act that somehow also functions as a ritual of avoidance. Nothing screams "I don't want to start this essay" like sharpening a pencil just a little bit more. The classic manual sharpener gave a satisfying scree, while modern electric sharpeners tend to sound like a blender having a breakdown. 1 minute of noisy over-sharpening and suddenly you've reduced your pencil to a 2-inch spear of defeat. And yet we do it anyway, because sharpening a pencil feels like progress, like preparation, like something's about to happen, even if that something is just a page full of crossouts and regret. In many social spaces, the pencil even developed its own form of etiquette. In classrooms, it's the go-to for quick notes, quiet doodles, and the occasional passive-aggressive poke from one desk to another. In offices, pencils became a sign of someone who didn't trust the finality of a pen, people who needed the option to edit, adjust, or erase their way through Monday. And in prisons, where pens are often banned for safety reasons, the pencil becomes a vital lifeline to write letters, draw, journal, or just mark the passing of time on cell walls. But beyond behaviors and quirks, the pencil also boasts an impressive lineup of famous users, people whose careers were practically powered by graphite. Take Ernest Hemingway, who often wrote in pencil while standing up because of course he did. It let him stay connected to the page while simultaneously looming over it like a literary god. Then there's Roald Dahl, who famously wrote all his books in pencil while sitting in a tiny shed, wrapped in a blanket, churning out twisted tales with the help of 6 freshly sharpened Ticonderogas. The man had a whole ritual, always pencils, never pens. One blunt tip, and the BFG had to wait. Architects, too, have long had a love affair with the pencil. The act of sketching buildings, lines, and precise angles practically demands a tool that can be both exact and erasable. Pencils were the backbone of blueprints, napkin sketches, and arguments over where the windows should go. And let's not forget cartoonists, who pencil in the whimsy before ink locks it down. Without the pencil, there's no rough draft, no warm-up act, no happy accidents that become punchlines. And through it all, the pencil remains stubbornly analog in a digital world. Laptops crash, tablets need charging. But the pencil is there, quiet, patient, slightly chewed, probably, but ready. So yes, it's a writing instrument, but it's also a fidget toy, a procrastination wand, a companion for anxiety, and the most loyal object to ever roll off a desk and under a couch. In a world ruled by touch screens, cloud documents, you'd think the humble pencil would have retired by now, perhaps to a dusty drawer somewhere, sipping graphite cocktails and telling stories about the Renaissance. And yet, here it is, still quietly poking around in backpacks, sketchbooks, tool belts and junk drawers. It hasn't just survived the digital age, it's thrived in the margins. Because for all our high-tech toys, there's still something irresistible about a stick that lets you make marks and then undo them. Despite tablets with pressure sensitivity and styluses that cost more than a small microwave, pencils are still used in some of the most important high-stakes environments on Earth. And occasionally off of it, architects still reach for them when planning buildings. Artists use them for initial sketches, storyboards, and the dramatic flourish of a signature in the corner. Engineers depend on pencils for field notes, mechanical drafts, and those tiny corrections that can make or break a design. And let's be honest, there's no app that can match the visceral satisfaction of smudging a perfect gradient with the side of your thumb. Even in classrooms where screens have muscled their way onto every desk, the pencil remains the first tool a child is handed to make their thoughts visible. Write your name at the top of the page, the teacher says, and the pencil obeys, quietly, dependably, without freezing or needing a firmware update. And then there's the matter of space. Ah yes, the legendary space pen versus pencil story, passed down like an intergalactic bedtime myth. You've probably heard it. They spent millions developing a pen that worked in zero gravity, while the others just brought pencils. It's the kind of tale that makes you smirk, shake your head at bureaucracy, and maybe tattoo "Keep it simple" on your arm. Except, it's not entirely true. Yes, early astronauts did use pencils, but wooden pencils posed risks in spacecraft. Graphite dust could interfere with electronics, and wood shavings could become tiny floating splinters of doom. So eventually they switched to pressurized pens, but not before the pencil had its moment among the stars. The truth may be less funny, but the myth lives on because it perfectly captures the pencil's enduring reputation. Simple, effective, and way less fussy than whatever that guy in IT just installed. Beyond function, the pencil has taken on a second life as a symbol, a metaphorical Swiss Army knife for expression, education, rebellion, and the occasional eyebrow adjustment. You'll find it tucked behind the ear of a carpenter, a poet, or someone pretending to do home repairs, worn down to a nub, kept out of loyalty or superstition, tucked into a bun, because sometimes your hair just needs a graphite-based support beam, given as a gift, especially those fancy engraved ones that look too nice to actually write with. The pencil even shows up in movies as a character prop, nervously twirled, angrily snapped, or dramatically dropped at the moment of breakthrough. But perhaps the real magic of the pencil lies in its relationship with failure. It's the only writing tool that assumes you're going to mess up. It doesn't scold you like a permanent marker or mock you like a typo in ink. It expects you to backtrack. It welcomes edits. It's designed for second chances. And after 500 years that still resonates, because while the world keeps pushing forward into holograms, the pencil remains the quiet companion that says, "Go ahead, try something. If it's wrong, we'll fix it." Sure, it still breaks. Sometimes the lead snaps inside the wood like it's emotionally overwhelmed. Sometimes you sharpen it so many times it shrinks into a tiny wand of disappointment. And occasionally you'll pull one out of your pencil case and find the eraser has fossilized into a pink rock of judgment. But despite its flaws, it keeps going. In classrooms and courtrooms, in journals and sketch pads, in exam halls and aeroplane tray tables where nothing else works. Because it's not just a tool, it's a statement, a reminder that ideas don't need to be perfect the first time, or even the second, that marks can be made and unmade, that creativity lives somewhere between that first hesitant line and the confident curve that follows. The pencil, a modest invention that never stops proving itself useful, delightful, and quietly rebellious in a world of glowing screens.